The First Seal. Academy of Death. Book 1. Chapter 1. Deliverance had never been inside a continuum of magic facility before today. They didn't welcome people like her, a half-blood witch with no known surname. Name. The hooded supernatural being, Super for short, phrased his question like a statement that was far beneath his notice. The Super sat behind a massive desk, and he didn't bother glancing her way. Deliverance, she answered, trying to mimic his bored tone just to see if she could. It was that or hurl profanities, and she didn't think that course of action would improve her current situation. Her mother, God rest her soul, was a blood witch hunted by the Order of the Continuum until her demise. Or so the sisters at the Temple of Mercy Lewis had once said, after a night of ale. The tips of her fingers began to tingle, like a buzzing in her bloodstream. No. 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 Do not do it. Don't think about it. Don't lose control. She released a slow, steady breath, willing the sparks of magic to recede. Surname, the Super continued, oblivious to her internal struggle. His jet-black hair absorbed light like a black hole, leaving Deliverance at the edge of the event horizon. Mackey. His dark, thick eyebrows raised slightly at her answer, but the rest of his expression stayed coolly neutral and his eyes remained on the paperwork. Your sire's surname? None. Her father, an unknown, had abandoned her mother, leaving her to whelp a child alone. I'm a bastard. Those 3 words finally got him to shoot a glance her way, and she held his violet eyes. They were startling in his otherwise ordinary face, and she couldn't help her piqued curiosity. Yeah. Those aren't normal in any sense of the word. She chewed on the thought. I wonder if they're sensitive to light, to the sun. Do you wear sunglasses or contacts over those? She'd long since known about supers, and the sisters weren't all that happy when her magical abilities began to manifest a year ago. The man's eyes narrowed, and the air in the room warmed and became heavy, almost dense. Deliverance huffed, then leaned back in her chair, holding her hands in her lap. What? I'm making small talk. Looking away, she took a moment to survey the room. She mentally catalogued all the old, leather-bound books in Latin, Spanish, Sanskrit, and a few other languages she couldn't place. Her gaze finally came to rest on a bookshelf full of Star Wars memorabilia, with a Yoda collection front and center. She laughed, unable to help herself, and then turned back to the Super who had followed her gaze and was now frowning. But really, what do you do about those freaky irises? It's not as if you can walk among humans like that. So, what do you do? Glasses? Contacts? Stare at the ground, and hope you don't run into anything? He met her question with infuriating silence, and then his expression returned to one of complete boredom. With a flick of a wrist, he opened a file on his desk. So, she ventured, but her word hung in the air between them unacknowledged. A heavy sigh left her lips. Are the cuffs necessary? She rattled the chains restricting her movement for emphasis, but the Super paid her no mind. Yes. They are. Head bowed, he continued to thumb through what she could only guess was a lengthy report on her, compliments of the good sisters from the temple. Seriously? She dropped her hands back into her lap with a muffled clang, then leaned back in the high leather-backed chair, placing her worn sneakers on the corner of his buff-to-shine desk. It's not like she could sweet-talk her way out of this place, so he might as well get the true Deliverance Mackey experience. When I get out of here, she relished the thought. Those hags will need more than ale to forget me. Back at the temple, she'd heard stories about the spellcasters, shifters, demons, Nephilim necromancers, and the undead vampires, the supers, who occupied the sacred halls of the world's continuums, but never in her wildest dreams did she imagine she'd see the inside of one. Hell, for a while, she wasn't sure she'd make it out of the temple to see fresh air after her last unsanctioned outing with the temple bus. And if the sisters had any say in the matter, she'd still be in the deep underbelly of the building, the bowels where the bad children are kept, awaiting sentencing. But hey, she thought to herself, this beats peeling potatoes or scrubbing floors all day. During her escort into the building, she had noticed the stench of sage and runes strategically positioned on the exterior of the property, which confirmed what she had long since suspected. The whole place was cloaked to the human eye and required an invitation to enter. The continuums were a closely guarded secret from the human world, and she had finally been let into the club, if handcuffs and heavy supervision counted as an invitation. "Hey." She broke the heavy silence in the room again, hoping to get a rise out of whoever the hell this guy thought he was. "You're what, 6'2"? Taller?" She raised her arms and rattled the chains again. "What exactly do you think a girl like me will do to a grown man like you?" "It's not like I can hurt you." She glanced at the nameplate on the desk, Pete Helms. The corners of her lips turned down. "Did I say that right? And what exactly are you here in the big bad continuum, petty boy? A secretary? Maybe a counselor?" The heavy wooden door behind her swung open with a dull thud, and in popped the head of a thin, fragile-looking woman with white hair. She quickly flounced inside the room, her long skirt swishing around her boot-covered ankles. "Headmaster Helms," she began, giving Deliverance a curious once-over. The woman's t-shirt read, "Feed the root source and nurture nature" in bold print. Why wasn't I informed a fledgling had arrived? Her mousy voice caught Deliverance off guard, and unable to stifle her laughter, she threw her head back and let herself laugh. "Well, that explains the office decor, Headmaster Petty." She held on to her sides as best she could while in cuffs. "But now you," she pointed at the woman, "are an interesting character. You're like a pot-smokin', Woodstock hippie version of Mary Poppins. A bold aesthetic choice, but props for the commitment." The woman looked offended, and it screwed up the peaceful mask of her face. Deliverance could just make out the mousy voice stammering over her renewed laughter. Do you always talk to your elders this way? Good heavens, child." She shot a stern look at the man behind the desk. "Headmaster? Headmaster, I demand an explanation." White hair swished over the woman's shoulders. Her gaze flicked between Deliverance and the headmaster, and for a split second, Deliverance was sure a few of the locks slithered. "Professor Renove." The headmaster, nose still stuck in Deliverance's file, motioned to a chair. "Have a seat." Chapter 2. Professor Renove gracefully sank into the remaining chair on the near side of the headmaster's desk, and shot Deliverance a look of baffled disapproval. Deliverance did her best to put a lid on her laughing fit, and decided to keep an eye on the professor's slithering hair, just in case. "Headmaster," Professor Renove began, but she was silenced by a raised hand and the headmaster's full attention. Finally, Deliverance thought, "Let's get this over with. Professor, this is Deliverance Mackey. She's a fledgling blood witch who has just arrived in our custody." "Arrived? Seriously, Petty?" His freakish gaze held a firm warning, a sit there and shut the fuck up warning. "I have reviewed her file, and was just about to inform her of continuum protocol, so it's good you're here." "She's a blood witch?" The professor studied Deliverance more closely. "But she is sitting right here," Deliverance snapped, lifting her hands to wiggle her fingers in the professor's direction. "In these ridiculous cuffs, with no idea what you're talking about. Can we involve me in the conversation, or do I have to listen to you two blather all day?" The professor turned an alarming shade of pink. Before she could complain about Deliverance's insubordination, or whatever lecture was obviously on the tip of her tongue, the headmaster snapped the file shut, drawing her attention back to him as well as that of the professor. "Deliverance, are you familiar with the classes of magic in supernatural beings?" She wrinkled her nose in disgust. "What, like algebra? Do supers use algebra?" The headmaster frowned but ignored her question. Again, different types of supernatural beings are categorized into classes according to their strengths and volatility, on a scale from 1 to 6. The lower the class number, the more reliable the super. The higher the number, the more dangerous the magic is, both to the user and the world at large. There was a pause, probably for dramatic effect, but Deliverance wasn't particularly moved. She leaned toward Professor Renove and stage whispered, "Should I be taking notes for a pop quiz or something?" The headmaster placed his hands on top of Deliverance's file, then raised his violet eyes to meet hers again. Blood witches are Class 5 magic users. Overtly volatile, with the potential to be extremely dangerous. Classes 5 and 6 have special rules that they are held to by continuum laws, and these rules now apply to you. Oh great, Deliverance thought bitterly. More rules. My favorite. Rules like what? Folding her arms as much as she could with the cuffs, she held the headmaster's gaze. It surprised her to see that he looked almost sorry. The serious glint in his eyes was such a stark contrast to his earlier boredom. Deliverance felt her snarky exterior begin to crack. What exactly did I get myself into? Class 5 and 6 supers are required to undergo formal training by the Order of Magic at one of their academies, which is where you find yourself today. Should you succeed? Wait, hold up. Deliverance leaned forward in the chair. I have to go to school here? My scary class rules are doing homework? Should you succeed, the headmaster repeated, you will graduate from the academy as a fully trained blood witch with both the ability to control your magic and the discipline to keep yourself and others safe. Deliverance had the feeling that a shoe was about to drop, so she decided to bite. Might as well rip the bandage off instead of drawing it out anymore. And if I fail? Well, Professor Renov spoke this time, her mousy voice somber. You will be executed. The world cannot handle high classes of magic without training, and so your options are to train with us or euthanasia. What do they think I am? Annoyance crept over her like a prickly old woman nun shawl. A stray on the streets? Deliverance sat back in the chair, exhaling sharply. Huh. Well, with a sales pitch like that, I doubt you have a long rejection list. The headmaster stood from behind his desk, prompting Professor Renov to follow suit. Deliverance remained seated, half processing this new information and half just because she could. Deliverance Mackey, you have been given two options. Either you will join the academy here, where you will apply yourself and work toward a successful graduation, or you will be put to death as stated by order law for an unconditioned and untrained Class 5 blood witch. What say you? I say this majorly blows, she thought, but didn't speak the words aloud. Instead, she stood and shrugged her shoulders, trying to look unbothered despite the coil of tension winding its way around her spine. I say that I guess I'm going back to school. She raised her arms. Now can the cuffs come off? Chapter 3. It might look big now, but you'll get used to it. Professor Renov sauntered down a long, narrow corridor. This concludes the tour of the academy. Deliverance tried to establish a mental map of the corridors and classrooms. She was disappointed, but not surprised to note that while the grounds seemed easily accessible, the only way on or off the property was through the gates she had passed through that morning. The heavily warded gates would probably zap her if she tried to leave without permission. It was bigger than the temple, but she could already feel the tension of being locked into a confined space. A bigger cage is still a cage, she thought moodily, only half paying attention to the professor's rehearsed speech. She didn't care about the history of the building. She just wanted to figure out the fastest and easiest way to graduate, and then get the hell out. Where are we? The dormitory. Deliverance couldn't help the involuntary groan that escaped her. She hoped she didn't have a roommate. Or at least if she did, that her roommate didn't have a stick shoved up her ass like Renov. This way. The professor climbed the steps to the second floor. You're at the end of the hall. The hippie walked in first, and Deliverance almost collapsed with relief when she only saw one bed. It was a single room, which meant no roommate. Finally, a fucking break from the shit show, she thought. Any questions? Professor Renov asked right when Deliverance decided to tune back into the monologue. When do classes start? They've already started, Professor Renov said. We're about 2 weeks into the current term. Of course you are, Deliverance muttered. I get roped into school, and I'm already behind. Perfect. You'll catch up in no time. Not like I have a choice, she interrupted, leveling a stare at the professor. Any more attempts at reassurance dissolved from the air, and Professor Renove pressed her lips into a thin line. It may not feel like a choice, but your behavior will dictate your academic career. For example, some students excel and are fast-tracked through their courses. Others stagnate and are held back. I'm not a complete imbecile, Miss Mackey, which means I'm aware of your desire to leave and be done with us as soon as possible. Or am I misreading the situation? Deliverance crossed her arms defiantly, but couldn't help but study her shoes. No, you've about hit the nail on the head. Excellent, Professor Renove chirped. I'll have your class schedule sent up right away, and I'll most likely see you sometime in the next couple of days. I teach plant and crystal-based magic, including an introductory course each term, which is a mandatory requirement. Deliverance made half-hearted jazz hands. Super stoked, Professor. My ta will be by shortly with your schedule. What about my stuff from the temple? Oh, you won't need any of that. The order will provide all you need inside these walls. Great. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes, then thought, what the hell, and let the roll fest begin. Can't wait. I'll leave you to settle in. Have a good evening, Miss Mackey. With a swirl of skirts, Renove flounced out of the room and closed the door behind her. God, it must be exhausting flouncing around everywhere, Deliverance thought. She shook her head and explored her little room, starting with the door and window. Both had locks that could be either engaged or disengaged, which was encouraging. At least I'm not locked in here, she mused, then her gaze followed the fence line to the gate entrance. Just inside the big-ass cage of iron, there was a bathroom that had more than likely been a broom cupboard in an earlier life, and a pair of sliding doors that looked like it could be a closet. She slid the door aside. Oh no. There were 5 pairs of identical uniforms on hangers in the closet. Of all the indignities she had faced today, having to wear a uniform was possibly the most offensive. Fuck. She slammed the closet door shut, strode to the bed, grabbed a pillow, and screamed into it as loud as she could. Fuck. Fuck. Fuckity fuck. There was a knock on the door, and Deliverance whipped her head around to focus on the sound. Her door remained closed. So she waited, and then another hesitant knock sounded on the wood. She cocked her head curiously, punched the pillow, rose to her feet, and then padded silently to the door. At the temple, there had been no privacy. No knock, definitely no second knock, and so the experience was practically a novelty. When she reached the door, she swung it open as fast as she could, and came face to face with a boy about her age who had a hand raised to knock again. Well, hello there. A grin played on her lips. Oh, hi. He was cute in a bookish way, but it might have been from the stuffy uniform. Seriously, what's up with school uniforms being all plaid and starched dress shirts? The boy shrugged and clutched a few sheets of paper tighter to his chest. He blinked at her curiously with bright copper eyes. Why couldn't I be a super with cool eyes? She sighed. Her eyes were so dark they were almost black, which had given the sisters at the temple some good fuel for their belief that Deliverance was evil incarnate. She quirked an eyebrow at the boy, aiming for nonchalance. So, can I help you? I have your class schedule. The paper rustled, scraping against the coarse fabric of his shirt. From Professor Renove. Ah, so you're the TA. He smiled and held out the papers. I'm Oliver. Deliverance. She took the papers and leaned against the doorframe while she studied the classes. So, Oliver, what's the real deal with this school? He was silent, so she glanced up and found him looking confused. She noticed he had a wash of freckles across his nose, and that if she looked past the tacky uniform, he was pretty attractive. She folded the papers and tucked them in her back pocket, then crossed her arms. I spent the last half-hour listening to the welcome wagon spiel, courtesy of Professor Woodstock, but I want the student version. The real version. Oliver smirked and crossed his arms in a mirrored image of her body language. Professor Renove isn't so bad once you get to know her. Sure, she's kinda granola and Wiccan, but she's good at teaching. Says her trusty TA. He laughed. Fair point. Deliverance smiled. She couldn't help it. His laughter was warm and infectious, and it was the first time all day that she had been treated as an average person. Focus, Deliverance, she chastised herself. You're here to speed run through the academy, graduate and bail. You're not here for boys, even if they do have copper eyes and a great laugh. So, what's up with the academy? What's it like? And what kind of super are you that landed you here too? She didn't dare add. It's a lot like regular school, just with cooler coursework. Instead of human history, we studied the history of magic. Instead of chemistry class, we work with plants and crystals with Professor Renove. Deliverance felt hope flutter in her chest. Maybe this graduate or die situation would be easier than she thought. What about instead of math? He grinned at her. Oh, we still have math, but mostly just for astronomy and measurements for spells. Figures? She huffed. Okay, what other kinds of classes are there? Oliver shifted to stuff his hands in his pockets, looking a bit self-conscious and a whole lot of adorable. It's only my second year here, so I'm still mostly in the basic courses. I'm taught for Professor Renove's class. Then I have magic history and basic elemental magic theory. Oh, and Latin. Deliverance wrinkled her nose. Ah, Latin. I saw it on my schedule too. What section are you in? Maybe we have the same class? Oliver flinched apologetically. We're not in the same class. I'm in an independent studies section with Professor Hawthorne, because he's the only other person here who's fluent in both Latin and Sanskrit. Only other person. Deliverance gaped at him. There was apparently more to this boy than met the eye. How are you fluent in both Latin and Sanskrit? More importantly, why are you fluent in them of all things? They're dead languages. He shrugged his shoulders and smiled shyly. I'm a natural polyglot. Language is kind of my thing. Deliverance sighed. Can't relate. Latin is going to be a major drag. I could always, help you. If you wanted. He blushed, and it made his freckles stand out in starker contrast with his skin. Deliverance smiled back, daring to flirt despite her logical brain screaming at her to stop. Well, polyglot Oliver, I just may take you up on that. They stood there for a second, a low hum of energy crackling between them. A chiming tone broke the silent spell between them. Oliver pulled a phone out of his pocket and pressed a button to silence it. I've got to go. I'm sure I'll see you around though. He flashed a grin at her. We're both in Professor Renove's intro class tomorrow morning. I'll be sitting in the back row, closest to the door. He lifted the phone in a small wave, then turned and walked down the hallway, tapping quickly on the screen as he walked. Deliverance closed the door to her room, then stood with her back pressed against it. She pulled out her schedule and saw that Oliver was right. She had Renove first thing tomorrow. He must have looked at her schedule to see if they had classes together. She let herself giggle since she was in the privacy of her room, then resumed her exploration. Tonight, she thought, Operation Physical Reconnaissance takes flight. Finding the boundaries of her fancy new cage and seeing just how far the bars could bend without breaking topped number 1 on her list. Tomorrow, she would dive into the social waters. If the academy was anything like other schools, it would be necessary to quickly identify the friendly fish from the circling sharks, and where exactly she fits in the food chain. Chapter 4. The following day, Deliverance sat on her bed surrounded by all her new school things, and willed a black hole to spontaneously open in her room so that she could be whisked away into nothingness. She had finally dared to try on one of her new uniforms, and much to her horror it fit perfectly. Deliverance had hoped she could plead ill-fitting clothes and put off the uniform life for a day or two, but it turns out magical schools make for annoyingly excellent tailors. A backpack had appeared outside her door sometime overnight, and she had rifled through the contents in the early morning hours. The threat of execution, combined with new school jitters, meant that her sleep had been even lighter than usual, and she admitted to herself that she was a bit shaken by the backpack's silent arrival. She hadn't heard footsteps or the scrape of fabric against the door. It had been tranquil, and Deliverance didn't like people sneaking up on her. Well, I'm not surrounded by bumbling humans anymore, she thought, then considered all the curveballs magic could throw her way. She had brought in the backpack as soon as she realized it was there, and immediately locked the door, making a mental note that working locks didn't guarantee privacy in a school full of supers. The entirety of her physical possessions now consisted of 4 notebooks, 4 small textbooks, 2 pens, a smartphone, to her surprise, a key to her dorm room and the backpack they all had arrived in. She didn't include her uniforms in the tally on principle. She had explored the smartphone a bit, grateful for the technology but not entirely trusting it. The phone was identical to Oliver's, so she guessed they were standard issue for students. There were pre-programmed numbers for faculty, a calendar with her class schedule already set up, and essential utilities like a calculator and notepad. She had tested her freedom by trying to download a solitaire app, and was pleasantly surprised to find she had internet access that quickly installed the game. It was definitely used to track their movements, but she should get some use out of the device as long as she was on the property. Deliverance surveyed her things, and then methodically put everything into the bag, taking note of how much room she had left. A benefit of having so little was that she could store everything in her backpack, then keep it with her. She didn't want to leave out any belongings for supers to snoop through, and if there happened to be a small window of opportunity to squeak through the school perimeter, then she'd be prepared. A little preparation never hurt anybody. Plus, she could play the new girl card for a while because she was learning her way around the school. This first week would be vital in exploring the buildings, because she still had plausible deniability. The golden words, "I didn't know any better," wouldn't last forever, but she figured she could stretch it a week if she needed to. It felt good to have a plan, but now she was stuck sitting on her bed, paralyzed at the thought of walking into a classroom full of strangers and being the awkward new kid. She had puddle jumped between schools every few months as a kid, but she never got used to being the new girl or the inevitable uprooting that came soon after. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself. "It's just a stupid school. You're going to skate through as painlessly as possible, and then be gone. No investment, no attachments." But there were always attachments. Already, she was looking forward to seeing Oliver again, the only person her age she had officially met here, and she had only been at the academy for less than a day. Deliverance dared a look at her phone and groaned. She couldn't hide in her room any longer, or else she was going to be late, and she didn't want to draw any more attention to herself than there would already be. Now's as good of a time as any. She shouldered her backpack, pulled at the hem of her ridiculous plaid skirt, and slipped into the hallway to begin her first day at the academy. Chapter 5. Professor Renault's classroom was easy enough to find, and Deliverance made it just in time. She spotted Oliver where he said he'd be, and quickly made her way to the empty seat beside him. He grinned at her. "Hey." His lips curled into an awkward grin. "How'd you?" The door to the classroom slammed shut, silencing all the chatter. "Good morning, class, and thank you for being on time." The professor flounced to her desk. A skirt similar to yesterday's swished around her legs. "Before we begin, we have a new student joining us. Is Deliverance here?" Deliverance raised her hand and tried to look unbothered, even though she wanted to sink into her chair and disappear beneath her desk. Professor Renault spotted her raised hand. "Oh good, you've already found Oliver." She pointed in acknowledgement. "Now Oliver as Ta, I'm tasking you with getting Deliverance up to speed with the last 2 weeks. Can you handle that?" "Yes, ma'am." Oliver nodded, then glanced at Deliverance to give her a reassuring smile. "Excellent," the professor continued. "Now last week, we wrapped up basic supplies that have inherent warding properties, which brings us to a new unit. Over this 3rd week, we will cover essential linguistic structure for summoning spells." Did she just say spells? Deliverance kept her voice low. "Yes, Miss Mackey, I did." She shot Deliverance a glance that said, "Listen but don't talk or else." Combined with the warding knowledge you now have, she continued to address the class, we'll conduct a simple summoning ritual to conjure your familiars. Bursts of excited chatter swept through the room, and Deliverance glanced over at Oliver. He was hanging on the professor's every word, but turned to grin at Deliverance, eyes sparkling with unbridled enthusiasm. This was my favorite unit when I took the class last year. Having a familiar is a total game changer. Deliverance felt a spark of excitement in her chest, despite herself. Oliver's right, she mused. This course works way cooler than any class I've ever had with humans, whispers Deliverance. She had heard of familiars, mostly the pop culture cliché of witches having black cats hanging around, but she had never given it much thought. I'm a blood witch. She sighed. Wonder what kind of family blood witches end up with. Don't let it be something strange, gross, or weird. The rest of Professor Renault's class passed in a mousy, flouncing whirlwind, and Deliverance tried to keep up as best she could. She was glad she would have Oliver to help catch her up, because it was clear no one would be slowing down for her. Once the class had ended, all of the students gathered their things, then streamed out into the hallway. What's your next class? Oliver shoved a notebook into his backpack that was identical to hers. Latin. Deliverance rolled her eyes. Can't wait. Oliver stood, swinging his bag onto one shoulder but not moving toward the door. Latin's not so bad. Besides, Professor Hawthorne is great. You'll like him. Says the natural polyglot, Deliverance muttered. Oliver laughed softly, then nodded his head toward the door. Come on, I'll show you where your classes are. She followed him into the hall, now swarming with students like him, which made her feel like a lone salmon trying to swim through a sea of ravenous carnivores looking to tear flesh off the bone. He cut a path through the arms and legs, pointed out her classrooms, then finally came to a stop in front of a door at the end of the hall. Here's Professor Hawthorne's classroom. I don't think we have any other classes together. But I'm sure you'll be fine. Thanks. Deliverance, too overwhelmed to come up with a sarcastic comment, just gawked at the inside of the room plastered with Latin phrases. Oliver's eyes softened and he smiled. I know it's a lot, but the professors here are really good. We have lunch at different times, but maybe I'll find you at dinner? I usually sit by myself, so it would be nice to have the company. Deliverance nodded, glad to have at least one person in her corner. Thanks, Oliver. You're going to be fine. I'll see you at dinner. He winked at her, and wove through the remaining clusters of students finding their way to their respective classrooms. Deliverance watched him go, pondering the wink. She was definitely catching flirtatious vibes, but he had also been roped into showing her around, so maybe he was just being nice? She shook her head. It didn't matter if he was flirting or not. She had to focus, first to catch up and then to graduate. That was the end goal. Nothing fancy, just passing courses as fast as possible. Crossing the threshold of the entryway to the Latin classroom, she habitually made her way to one of the seats in the back. There'll be time to figure Oliver out later, step one at a time, she thought. Today's goal, surviving day 1. Chapter 6. Deliverance was exhausted, but also exhilarated. Her classes had been a whirlwind of playing catch-up, which she had done countless times when switching schools, but for the first time in her life, she was interested in the material. Even Latin had been tolerable. It turned out that Professor Hawthorne's fluency in a number of languages was thanks to centuries of study made possible by him being a vampire. Meeting a vampire in person hit an all-time first for her, and besides the particularly long and sharp canines barely visible when he spoke, he looked like every other professor she had encountered throughout the day, strict, boring, and a joy kill. Her mind buzzed with everything she had learned, and even the daunting prospect of catching up 2 weeks' worth of magic didn't dull her excitement because she was learning magic. She had grabbed a quick lunch earlier, spending the rest of the time exploring the corridors and perimeter of the main building, so she knew where the dining hall was when the bell chimed for dinner. Hand on the handle, she yanked open the door and was met by a swarm of students all gathered around tables and chattering with each other. Not one to dawdle for fear of missing a meal, she quickly grabbed some food plus some extra to stash in her backpack and room just in case, and then scanned the sectioned off cliques in the crowd for Oliver. He sat by a bank of windows, and when he caught her eye, he waved and beckoned her to the table. Balancing her tray to keep it from getting jostled too badly, she wove her way through the tangled weave of students until she could slip onto the seat across from him. She leaned against the back of the chair and let out a long exhale, then looked up to find Oliver watching her with a goofy-ass grin on his face. "So? How was it?" he prompted her. "Tell me about your day. You seem to be intact, so I'm hoping it went okay?" "It was busy, but yes, I'm intact," she admitted with a smile. "I had no idea there would be so many students here. So many supers all in one place." "Yeah, there's a little bit of everything. What did you think of Professor Hawthorne? He's cool, right? You could have mentioned he was a vamp." She picked up her fork and pointing it at him. "The heads up would have been nice." Oliver smirked. "None of us got any warning. I didn't see why you should either. What about your other classes? What did you think?" "They were, well, a lot. Honestly, I have no idea how I'm going to catch up." She focused on her plate, stabbing a few pieces of the lettuce in her salad. "I'm only 2 weeks behind in courses, but I've spent most of my life with humans, so I feel even further behind. It's all so surreal, you know?" "Hey," Oliver said softly, prompting her to meet his gaze. "I'll help you catch up. It's overwhelming right now, but we'll get you back on track." Deliverance felt the stirring of that energy simmering between them again, and she wondered if he felt it too. "Hey Oliver, you feel that spark? That electric jolt when we touch?" She chuckled at her unspoken words. "What's so funny?" "Nothing." The tips of her ears warmed, and from prior experience she just knew her exposed ears now matched her flaming pixie-styled red hair. A strawberry blonde strode up to the table and looked pointedly at Oliver with her brows raised. Oliver looked at the girl with a frown on his face, and Deliverance immediately caught the shift in the air. There's history between these two. Interesting." "Hi Oliver," the ginger said, her voice chipper in a fake way. "Why don't you come sit with us back at our regular table?" The girl glanced at Deliverance, scanned her up and down once, and then turned her attention back to Oliver. Deliverance didn't know if she should be offended, or if she should laugh at the painfully obvious posturing. "I'm good here," Oliver answered. "But thanks anyway." He crossed his arms and shot a smile at Deliverance that made her glow with gratitude. "What?" the ginger asked sarcastically. "Did Renault stick you with orientation for the new kid?" Deliverance did laugh at that, drawing a dagger glare from the girl. "I'm sorry, that was rude. Let me try again. I'm Deliverance, the bright and shiny new kid who needs the orientation. And who the fuck do you think you are exactly?" She smiled sweetly, which made the ginger flush a ruddy pink that was not flattering with her hair color. "I don't care who you are, new kid," the ginger spat. She turned to Oliver, conjuring up a mean smile. "Your spot at the table is open whenever you're done taking out the trash. See you in class." She walked away, leaving Deliverance and Oliver alone at the table. Deliverance shook her head, looking at Oliver with a raised eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" "Ex-girlfriend from last year." Oliver sighed, then rolled his eyes. "Lexi can be a bit mean sometimes." "Oh, sometimes? So it's not her factory default setting?" Oliver laughed, shooting her a wry smile. "Okay, most of the time. It's the reason why we broke up over break." And clearly she didn't take it well. "No so much. Sorry for the scene." Deliverance waved her fork to dismiss the statement, then stabbed at her salad again. "Not my first rodeo where mean girls are concerned. It was actually kind of mild by comparison. New kid is practically kind." Oliver huffed a laugh, leaning back away from their table. "It certainly lacks creativity on her part. Are you almost done eating? Can I walk you back to the dorm?" The abrupt shift in conversation caught Deliverance off guard, but chewing her last bite of salad gave her a chance to consider her answer. She didn't really want any enemies at this new school, especially from day one, but maybe Oliver would be worth it. She nodded in response to his question, finished with her salad and looped the strap of her backpack over one shoulder. Ready when you are. Oliver cleared his dishes and hers and brought them to the bus trays, then gestured for her to follow him. Outside, the setting sun shone through the leaves of the giant oaks and dappled the sidewalks. They walked in silence for a few minutes, but it wasn't uncomfortable. An uncanny skin-crawling sensation of predatory eyes drinking in her every move set her on edge. At her dorm building, Oliver walked her upstairs and all the way to her room. Deliverance got out her keys and opened the door, but she hesitated before crossing the threshold. "Thanks for walking me back. And for all of your help today." Oliver smiled, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "It's no problem, really. You'll catch up in no time. I guess I'll see you tomorrow." Deliverance nodded. Stepping into her room, she turned back to face him with a smile of her own. "Yeah, I'll see you with the rooster crows 3 times. There aren't any roosters at the academy." "Are you sure about that?" She leaned against the door frame. "I'm pretty sure I saw some aviation folk today. A ginger-haired harpy to be exact." With no warning, Oliver leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. He quickly stepped back, blushing bright pink, and Deliverance felt her face warming too. "Good night, Deliverance." He winked, then walked down the hallway, leaving Deliverance to close the door in a mild state of shock. She turned and leaned with her back against the door. Lifting a hand, she touched where his lips had brushed against her skin, and smiled despite herself. It was good to know that she wasn't alone in feeling the connection, but this definitely complicated things. So much for her plan to skate through and graduate with no attachments. Dropping her bag by her desk, she sprawled on her bed to study the ceiling, lost in thought. She summarized day 1 in her head, mentally ticking off points as she gathered them. 1. She was majorly behind in her classes. She would probably put in some study time overnight to catch up a bit, especially since she doubted she would ever sleep well inside, surrounded by an iron fortress. Which brought her to the second item to tally. She was now living in a campus full of supers. She would have to find ways to deal with people who made no sound when they moved outside of her room, plus any number of supernatural advantages that could make trouble for her. 3. Oliver. She could still see his copper eyes as they looked into hers, and they made a rush of warmth crash into her. Crushes were all well and good, but she would need to find out what kind of super he was and how to protect herself if necessary. She had learned the hard way the importance of self-preservation. Maybe she would be able to casually extract the information she needed, while he continued her orientation. There had to be more to Oliver than his copper eyes and his knack for languages, and she would find out what they were. 4. And the one she dreaded the most, she needed to get her finger on the social pulse of the school. Meeting Lexi had reminded her that there was a social pecking order and social politics set in motion before she ever arrived. Maybe Lexi's just a bitch, and Oliver dumped her ass because she's mean. But maybe Oliver had a mean streak as well, which first prompted the relationship. Lastly, good old number 5. She was trapped in a heavily warded campus, with plenty of locked doors and hidden secrets. The buildings she had been in today were a good start, but she would have to find the time and solitude with which to explore the rest of the grounds. There were so many loose ends, and they all made her anxious, but Deliverance felt better having consolidated most of them into 5 bullet points. She would start addressing the issue of her classwork tonight, and tomorrow, she would try to take another crack at polyglot Oliver. Plus, if she was being honest with herself, she wanted to spend more time with him. And maybe work toward more than a kiss on the cheek. The sun was setting, and her room was beginning to lose its natural light through the window, so she got up from her bed. She eyed the bed. Not ready for sleep yet. Grabbing her backpack, she sat at her desk and switched on the table lamp. She hated studying, but if her time at the temple had taught her anything, it was the phrase, "Know thine enemy," and its inherent value. She pulled out the notebook she had dedicated to Renov's class and its corresponding textbook. Before she began, she spared a quick glance at her bedroom door. She wondered if her silent visitor would return tonight. Deliverance huffed a sigh. It was going to be a long night. She opened her notebook to a new page, and the textbook to the first chapter. Okay, she let out a deep breath. Time to evaluate just how far behind I really am. Chapter 7. A blaring horn rung in her ears. One eye open, she glared at the alarm flashing on her cell. It took all her willpower to not throw the noisy electronic device across the room. She had stayed up as late as she dared the night before, and had gotten through almost a week of material, but was still hopelessly behind in her classwork. I'm never gonna get this shit straight. She sighed. Who the fuck cares about annuals and perennials? Names of plants swirled in her head: rosemary, chamomile, bay, rue, lavender, yarrow to induce visions, mint, basil, rose, mugwort, sage, red hibiscus, elder for use in spell bags, nettle to guard one between this world and the next, pepper, cinnamon, salt, a whole fucking lot of salt, thyme, lemon balm, and damiana for an alter state of mind for ritualist use only, or so the hippie said. But from what she could tell, a person could go on a vision quest, hallucinate on damiana. Hell, the textbook said it could also generate feelings of euphoria and spice things up in the bedroom. Sliding the closet open to retrieve another one of her uniforms, a string of curse words fled her mouth. Once dressed, she slammed the door a little harder than necessary when she left for Renaud's class. When she arrived, Oliver was sitting in the same seat as yesterday with that goofy-ass grin. She returned the smile, hoping it didn't look as stupid as his expression, then made her way to the back of the classroom to take the seat next to him. How did you sleep? Any better than before? She started pulling out her supplies. It was a late night. A sigh and a yawn escaped. I've got a lot of catching up to do. So, it was a study night then? Oh yeah. She gave half-hearted jazz hands which made Oliver laugh. Ha, he said, you didn't really strike me as the academic type. She rolled her eyes. I'd be mildly offended if you weren't completely right. I am not a textbook person. I finally went to bed, because my eyes were beginning to cross and I didn't want them to get stuck that way. Now that would be a shame. Professor Renaud flounced into the room and swept the door shut behind her. Good morning, students. I take it you all are thrilled to be here first thing in the morning, yes? There was scattered laughter around the room, and Renaud gave them all an indulgent smile. As I mentioned yesterday, we will be beginning basic summoning structures. By the end of this week, you will have mastered the linguistic portion, and will be ready to complete a summoning for your familiars. Oliver, could you join me at the front, please? Oliver did as he was told, and stood next to Renaud at the front of the class. Now, Professor Renaud said, since for most of you this is your first year, Oliver here is a natural polyglot due to his allogist witch lineage. He can understand, read, and write all human languages. Deliverance perked up at this, making a mental note to research which lineage Oliver could belong to. As an allogist witch and my ta, Renaud continued, giving Oliver a fond look that made him beam with pride, he will be helping you with drafting and enunciating your spells. If even a syllable is incorrect, the spell will not work. Spellcasting is a fine art, but I promise it is very rewarding. The rest of the class was a blur of chatter, but it was invigorating. Deliverance was relieved that their summoning spells could be in English, but she had had no idea how important the rhyming and stressed syllables were. Fun fact, students. Professor Renaud fluttered around the room, making Deliverance wonder how many magic mushrooms she ate a day. That seemingly archaic language used for movie witches, well, let me tell you, it's actually based in fact. Seriously? I leaned in closer to Oliver. She's joking, right? No, I never joke about the proper form of spellcasting, Miss Mackey. She gave me the side eye. Now, using shorter words with hard consonants and clear meanings helps hone the intent of the spell and aids the success of the spell at a much higher rate. I bet she has bionic hearing, Deliverance whispered, or uses a spell for enhanced hearing. Otherwise, how else could she hear me? Oh, Miss Mackey, I hear all. The professor spun around a few desks, grabbed some cock, then added a few more plants to the already long list. Oliver, be a dear and look over everyone's spells. Yes, ma'am. Oliver winked, then circled the room offering phrasing advice. Deliverance was pleased to note that he definitely favored her corner of the room. By the end of the class period, she had a very rough draft of her personal summoning spell, and her head was spinning with the implications of spellcasting in general. The linguistics part was incredibly boring for her. Language wasn't one of her strong suits, but learning the truth about spells and replacing her pop culture fun facts with actual magical knowledge kicked in her endorphins, giving her a natural high. She could practically see the doors opening before her, and felt much less trapped in her own life. When the bell rung, Oliver waited for her to gather her belongings. You don't have to wait if you don't want to. I know my way around. Well, kind of. Who said I didn't want to? He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Actually, I want to, walk you to class if you're okay with that. The ginger-haired bitch with her witch patrol hovered at the door. Sure. I'm good with it. She couldn't resist the grin splitting her lips. But I'm not so sure about them. Don't worry about them. Oliver waved off my comment. They'll find someone or something new to torment. Yeah. A frown hit her lips. That's the problem. Let's get you to class before you're late. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, then grabbed mine, doing the same thing. She wasn't going to lie to herself, the gesture made her happy, and her inner self cheered. When Oliver walked her to Latin, she felt like she was walking on air. You're in a good mood, Oliver remarked once they got to Professor Hawthorne's class. For now, Deliverance said, I wouldn't expect an allegist to understand, but Latin is actually pretty hard for us mere mortals. Oliver looked embarrassed, and he shrugged. It makes spellcasting easier, but other than my thing with languages, I'm a pretty average student. Plus, if it makes you feel any better, my entire family is made up of allegist witches. I may be special here, but not at home. Deliverance felt bad for making the jab. She hadn't meant to hit quite so close to home, and so she reached out to squeeze his hand. Well, I think your thing with languages is pretty cool. She made air quotes with her free hand, and Oliver laced their fingers together. With one last squeeze, he let go of her hand, then grabbed the straps of the backpacks and then handed hers to her. I'll see you at dinner. He grinned, his coppery eyes glinting. Same spot? She nodded, and then Oliver was gone, leaving her to brave another round of Latin with her vampire professor sporting elongated fangs. Chapter 8. After classes, Deliverance got her food and found Oliver by the bank of windows again. She caught him up on her classes, and when she was done, he was grinning at her like an idiot. But a cute idiot with copper eyes. Why are you looking at me like that? He laughed and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're just so excited, it's cute. Ignoring the fact that he called her cute for now, she rolled her eyes instead. Yeah, well, it's probably the sleep deprivation. I have another long study night ahead of me. Do you want me to come over? He asked, then blushed and backpedaled. To help you study, I mean. Flashcards or whatever. Deliverance laughed at the embarrassed look on his face, but ended up shaking her head. I think it'll be a solo night for me. But I'll take a rain check. When he nodded in agreement, she almost collapsed in relief. Within minutes, their conversation went back to being relaxed. She knew that if Oliver came into her room late at night, very little studying would actually get done. Maybe after she had caught up with her classes, they could have a study night. She and Oliver finished dinner and began making their way back to the dorms, talking quietly or not talking at all. It was easy to be around Oliver, and she found she was enjoying having him around, even if they were just walking in comfortable silence. They walked up to Deliverance's room, and she fished out her keys from her backpack. Where's your room, by the way? She asked, idly spinning her keys around her finger. I think it's only fair since you know where mine is. Oliver leaned against the wall by her doorframe. Third floor of this building, on the other side. Room 345. I have a single like yours. I was so relieved when I found out I didn't have a roommate, Deliverance admitted, then winked. I don't play well with others. He laughed at that, and stuffed his hands into his back pockets. Deliverance was learning that he did that when he was nervous or self-conscious. I like not having a roommate most of the time. It gets a bit lonely, but at least I have privacy. You know, you could always come by if you wanted. To study or hang out or something. Or something, Deliverance thought, but did not say. She was undeniably attracted to Oliver, but she didn't want to rush into anything. Especially during her first week at a new school, and especially since he apparently had a psycho ex-girlfriend. Lexi hadn't interrupted their dinner today, but she had made eye contact with the crazed ginger a couple of times. Man, if looks could kill, she thought, I'd be dead by now. Room 345, I'll keep that in mind. She let herself into her room, turning back to give Oliver one last smile. Good night. I'll see you in the morning? Yeah, see you in the morning. He waved, then turned away to walk down the hall. Deliverance shut the door and went straight to her closet. When she had gotten dinner, she had swiped a few packages of chips and other small snacks and stashed them in her backpack. There were a few small cubbies in the back of her closet behind her atrocious uniforms, and she had decided during her study session it would be a good idea to have a stockpile of food on hand. Just in case. She moved to her desk and pulled out her books, ready to settle in for another long night. She had been honest with Oliver when she said she wasn't super big on schoolwork, but that was human school. For the first time in her life, she was learning about her people, and if she was honest, she couldn't get enough of it. That was the difference between her and Oliver, and probably the rest of the school. Deliverance was a nobody. She didn't have a family of witches or a proud lineage, she just had herself. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't hate that she was different. She decided to start with Renault's class first, then would tackle her courses in the order she took them every day. Skimming through her notes, she found where she had left off the previous night, took a deep breath and began. Chapter 9. The next morning, Deliverance walked into Professor Renault's class with grainy eyes but feeling better about her classes. She had stayed up later than planned, totally absorbed by her textbooks, and now had less than a week of work to catch up on. It would be a relief when she only had to absorb one day of studies at a time instead of bouncing back and forth. Oliver quirked an eyebrow at her as she dropped into her seat next to him. Long night? You have no idea, she muttered right before Renault flounced into the room. Class, we're going to jump right in today. We made excellent progress yesterday, and so today, you will be receiving your assigned partners for the summoning spell due by the end of the week, and you can break into pairs to further refine your wording. I'll be reading out the partners once and only once, so please pay attention. Deliverance listened to the list of names, willing her foggy brain to stay on task, and at the very end she finally heard her name called. Deliverance, since there are an odd number of students in this class and you're still catching up, I've paired you with Oliver. He can work with you on your spell and address any questions you may have about the work you've missed. Deliverance nodded, trying to keep a huge grin off her face. She glanced at Oliver, who was having less success at hiding his glee. Chop. Chop. Professor Renault clapped her hands twice, signaling the end of her speaking, and the classroom was immediately buzzing with conversation and the rustling of backpacks as students reshuffled themselves according to their assignments. Deliverance turned to Oliver, leaning an elbow on her desk to prop her chin up with one hand. Well, partner, where should we start? He mirrored her position and shrugged his shoulders. Since I don't have a spell, I guess we'll take a look at the wording you came up with yesterday. The quicker we can refine it, the quicker we can gather the supplies needed to summon your familiar. Deliverance reached down to pull out her schoolwork, too excited about the prospect of discovering her familiar to be self-conscious. She opened her notebook, but covered her writing with her hands, leveling Oliver with a look. I'm not an allegist or a poet. Rhyming is hard. So keep in mind that this is a rough draft, and try not to judge too harshly, okay? Oliver raided his hands in surrender. I'm only here to help. Let's see what you've got. Deliverance pushed her notebook over to his desk and watched his eyes scanning over her notes. He reached the bottom of the page, paused for a moment, and then started again from the top. A spike of nerves set her on edge, and she mentally prepared a self-defense via sarcasm. Your intent is already solid, which is usually where people get stuck. He pushed the notebook back over to her desk and caught her eye, giving her a reassuring smile. The wording is a little awkward, but as long as you can enunciate clearly, then it really only needs a little adjustment. She waited for more, but Oliver just sat there expectantly. Wait, she said, that's it? Oliver looked confused, his head tilting slightly. Yes? What do you mean? Deliverance glanced at her notes, then back up at him. My super rough draft only needs a little adjustment. Deliverance, spellcasting doesn't have to be fancy or poetic. That's what's so great about magic. He grinned at her, pointing at her notebook for emphasis. The mechanics of writing spells are maybe a third of what makes them work. Really? Yeah. The rest of it is the intent that the caster brings to the recitation. You wrote plainly and from the heart, so as long as you speak clearly, then your intent will follow through. Ha, Deliverance said quietly. I guess I thought I'd be bad at this stuff, and that it would need a lot of work. She looked up at Oliver, scrutinizing him. You really think it's okay? You're not just saying that? Oliver shook his head firmly. I am not just saying that. As a Ta, I am telling you that you've written a solid framework. Small tweaks are all it needs. Deliverance felt a glow of pride rush through her, and she smiled gratefully at Oliver. She turned to reach into her backpack for a pen, which is when she felt the familiar electric sparks of magic threatening to spark from her hands. Shit, 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 she chanted silently, willing the magic to recede. Deliverance? Oliver asked, from over her shoulder. My pens are at the bottom of my bag. Hang on, she said through gritted teeth. She plunged her hands as deep into her backpack as they would go, taking a few deep breaths while her hands throbbed and began to dully glow. Closing her eyes, she began counting with her breaths. In, out 1. In, out 2. By the time she reached 10, her hands were back to normal and she had her magic back under control. She grabbed a pen and sat up quickly, giving Oliver a sheepish smile. Sorry, kept dropping it. I guess I need to get some more sleep. Oliver seemed to accept her white lie, and Deliverance inwardly sighed in relief. She really did need to get more sleep. In all honesty, she couldn't risk any magical outbursts in a school full of supers. She had to be careful. The rest of the class passed quickly, and by the end of it, Deliverance had her summoning spell in its final form. It was much shorter than when she started, but she agreed with Oliver that her intent was clear. As long as she didn't stumble over her words, it should work just fine. She closed her notebook, beaming, and Oliver grinned. Hang on. He stood up, tapping the corner of her desk. I'll be right back. He made his way to the front of the room and pulled Renove aside for a brief conversation. It ended with her nodding at Oliver and shooting Deliverance an encouraging smile. Deliverance didn't have the heart to be annoyed like she was on her first day. Maybe Professor Woodstock wasn't so bad after all. Oliver came back and dropped into his desk, leaning over to bump their shoulders together. What was up with Renove? Deliverance asked, bumping him back. I told her your spell is done, and asked if we could use tomorrow's class period to perform the spell. All the other partners will need tomorrow as well, but to finish writing. And since I'm not drafting a spell, and we're done early, she's going to let us use the practicum chamber next door. Deliverance laughed. You asked a professor for permission to ditch class? And she said yes? Oliver frowned comically at her, which made her laugh again. We're not ditching class. We're just going to be doing classwork in a different room. Besides, she'll be right next door and will definitely pop in to make sure we're staying on task. Whatever you say, goody two-shoes. Within minutes, she found herself inside the practicum chamber. The walls covered in wooden shelves contained an array of books from around world, some new, others old and obscure. Hey. She plopped her pack on the floor, approached a row of books, and ran a finger over the worn spines. You took Renault's class last year, right? Yeah, why? He extracted a file full of papers from his bag. What is it? She took a few stolen glances, noting how his brows furrowed when in thought. What is what? Oliver placed 2 pens on the table, one black and one red. You're familiar. That's another topic for another day. A light chuckle passed his lips. But right now, we need to get to work on deciding what items to gather for your spell. He pulled a book off a shelf. Look through this book of ingredients and make a list, then we'll see what you'll need. While you do that, I'm going to look over a stack of spell drafts. Okay. Sounds good? She took a seat at a round table in the middle of the room, pulled out her notebook, cracked open the book, then made some notes. It surprised her at how eager she was to learn. She wanted to do well, had to do well because her life depended on it. But it was more than that. All her life, she had felt like a cylinder trying to live on a square block, never fitting in, and always found herself the freak people made fun of. But here at the academy, there was nothing unusual about her. In this instance, being a nobody made her feel almost normal. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. In Renault's classroom, next to the chamber, everyone scrambled to gather their things. Deliverance did the same, and Oliver walked her to Latin again. She liked that it was becoming a routine, that he was becoming a routine. It was comforting, but also exciting when they had moments alone. Even standing in front of Hawthorne's class felt like they were in a bubble of solitude all their own, and every time they found stolen moments, there would inevitably be that building of electricity between them. So who will act on it first? Deliverance couldn't help but wondered, then she grinned. Him or me? And when, not if, but when? Chapter 10. Oliver met her outside Renault's classroom the next day, and led her to one of the vacant practicum chambers. Inside it was a round room lined with shelves, full to bursting with the raw materials needed for spellcasting. There was everything from herbs and crystals, to matches and twine, all neatly organized and labeled in their proper places. Deliverance leaned over and stage whispered to Oliver, "Does Renault live in one of these Wiccan pods?" It would explain, well, everything about her. Oliver rolled his eyes and laughed. No, she doesn't live in a practicum chamber, but she is in charge of keeping everything organized. She can be a little uptight. But she loves what she does and it shows in her work. You'll come around to the professor eventually. Deliverance wasn't so sure, still stuck on their disastrous first meeting a few days earlier, replayed in her head. Have I really only been at the academy for a few days? And now, getting ready to complete a summoning spell. The thoughts baffled her. Oliver set up a small table in the center of the room, while she walked the perimeter. Her fingertips trailed lightly over the neat labels, and she pulled some of the materials she would need for the spell. She gathered some sage for perimeter binding, already trying to think of ways to get the stench out of her awful uniform, a quartz crystal for amplification of her fledgling magic, and a simple white votive candle to mark the center of her spell. Oliver tapped her on the shoulder and Deliverance jumped, eliciting a curious look from him. I have some matches for the sage and candle. Do you have everything else you need? Yeah, I think so, she said, trying to play off how jumpy she was. There's so much stuff in here. I'm amazed it took so long to find just 3 things. Renault flounced through the door, saving Deliverance from having to answer any more of his questions. Good morning, Oliver. Deliverance. Class will be underway shortly, so I wanted to check in to make sure you have everything you need for your summoning. I think we're all good, Professor, Oliver said brightly. Deliverance was less sure now that nerves were starting to set in, but she put on a smile and nodded along anyway. Excellent. I'll be back to check in after I've situated the rest of the class. Good luck, Deliverance. The professor spared them a quick smile, then turned on her heel and flounced out of the room as quickly as she had come, leaving Oliver and Deliverance alone in the practicum chamber. Oliver gave Deliverance a quick once-over and cocked his head. "Are you okay? Nervous about the spell?" "A little," she admitted. "First tried a summoning spell and all that. Plus, knowing a cute guy is in attendance to witness my feat of magic only adds to the stress." These words she kept to herself. The knowledge she could make a complete fool of herself wasn't instilling confidence. He shook his head, smiling. "You're going to do fine. It'll all be over before you know it, and then you'll have a familiar. After, we can go get some food while the dining hall is still quiet. Deal?" Before Deliverance could agree, Oliver's phone chimed. He glanced at it and frowned, then he unlocked the screen to type out a quick reply. He set it back down and to face Deliverance, but then it chimed again and he groaned. "Something important?" Deliverance ventured, unaccustomed to seeing Oliver looking so frustrated. "Sorry, no. I'm going to turn this stupid thing off." "Who is it?" "It's Lexi. She texted me late last night and we've been fighting ever since." I shouldn't have even replied. It was Deliverance's turn to frown. Why had Lexi texted Oliver late at night? And why had Oliver responded? She decided to venture a bit further, too curious to help herself. "What are you guys fighting about?" Oliver made a few more taps on his phone, then placed it upside down on the table so that he could give Deliverance his full attention. His copper-colored eyes regarded her seriously, and then made way for a hesitant smile. "She didn't take the breakup well, and is apparently thinking that we're on an extended break instead of completely split." He sighed. "She noticed that I've been spending a lot of time with you, and just..." He trailed off, looking down at his shoes. "I like you a lot, Deliverance. She can tell and it's making her mad, but I don't care. I can't help it." He glanced up at her self-consciously, and Deliverance felt the undercurrent of energy between them waking up again. She held his gaze, thinking about what he had said, and was relieved that her first read had been correct. There was definitely a connection between them. "I wasn't expecting a psycho ex-girlfriend," Deliverance said, "but I like you too." Oliver stepped toward her, closing the distance, and magnifying the energy between them with every step. He stopped inches away from her, so close that they shared breath for a moment, and then he reached up a hand to trace her jawline. She leaned into the touch, and her eyes helplessly dropped to his mouth. "I'm going to kiss you." He leaned in to brush his lips against hers, and it was so natural to pull him closer. Her hands traced up his neck and tangled in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, and he gripped her by the waist to keep them steady. The kisses deepened, his grip on her tightened, and when her tongue met his, Oliver moaned softly against her mouth. His hands started roaming her body, and his kisses seared down her neck. Deliverance gasped, loving the feel of him under her hands, but when she opened her eyes, she was slammed back to reality. They were making out in a classroom, with their super classmates and professor on the other side of a wall, and with the door unlocked. Deliverance grabbed Oliver's wrists, pulling him out of the moment as well, and he looked at her with a dopey smile and lips plump with arousal. "Not yet," Deliverance panted, trying to rein in her physical attraction to Oliver. "Not here." Oliver took a step back, and the extra distance seemed to drain the tension out of the moment. The connection between them faded into a low hum. "Right," Oliver said, sounding a bit out of breath as well. "So, summoning spell?" Deliverance laughed, she had to, and Oliver grinned. "Yes," she said, "summoning spell. Let me get my notebook." Chapter 11. Together they gathered the ingredients, laying them out in order, in surprisingly comfortable silence. Sure, the air was still thick with sexual tension, but it wasn't awkward the way Deliverance had been dreading. Soon enough, everything was set, and Oliver gave her a quick kiss on the cheek that made her pulse spike. "What was that for?" She tried and failed to keep her traitorous eyes from falling back to his mouth. He laughed and backed another step further away. "For luck." His tone evened out into what Deliverance thought of as his taut voice. "Remember, spellcasting is directed by intent. The raw materials and words of the spell will help guide you, but the intent is up to you. Just focus and you'll be fine. Focus? Seriously? After all that? Deliverance thought. Yeah, right. Easier said than done. She rolled her eyes at him, then turned back to the materials before her. She was nervous again, and the fear of failure smothered the endorphin rush caused by the kiss. This would be her first real test as a super, and it was simple, but she had the irrational fear that her magic would abandon her. Her relationship with her magic was a lot like her relationship with her mother had been before she had landed at the temple, erratic at best. Deliverance took a steadying breath, trying to sift through her scattered thoughts and focus her mind on the spell. Having a familiar would mean so much to her, as both a witch and a student. Maybe then she would finally feel like she belonged. Like she had a chance at finding her true place in the world. Gulping nervously, she lit a match and touched it first to the votive and then to the sage, so that it would start smoking. Careful not to jostle the quartz, she pulled her notebook closer so she could read the words there. Hear my call across the land, meet me here, this I demand. Familiar followed this spell song, meet me here where you belong. Find my circle and come to me. Meet me here, so mote it be. The quartz crystal began to glow as Deliverance spoke the spell, and when she finished, there was a beat of heavy silence before the crystal shattered in a burst of light that sent her flying back into Oliver. Tendrils of smoke snaked upward from the still-burning sage. They began to thicken and spread, fanning out into 5 points in front of her before coalescing into columns of swirling smoke. The smoke began to shift, each pillar taking on a tinge of color, gray, white, black, red, and pale green. Deliverance grabbed at Oliver's arm as 5 figures appeared from within the smoke, each stepping forward with heads held high. They appeared to be men, and Deliverance probably wouldn't have given them a second look if she hadn't watched them appear from columns of colored smoke. She tore her eyes away to glance at Oliver, who was squinting into the haze. The man in the center, who had appeared from the gray column of smoke, looked at them and cocked his head. Hello, Deliverance, the man said. We've been waiting for you to call. Call? Deliverance shook her head. I didn't call you. I called my familiar. Who the hell are you? All of you. Oliver grabbed her hand and stepped in front of her, looking worriedly into her eyes. She turned a bit, so that she could keep an eye on the newcomers. Oliver, what the hell is going on? What do you mean? Oliver asked. And who are you talking to? I'm the only one here. Deliverance's gaze snapped to him. They're standing right there. And let me tell you, they don't look like any familiars I've ever seen. What happened to the spell? Oliver turned to look behind him, then back to Deliverance with concern in his eyes. It's okay that the spell didn't work the first time, we can try again. You're familiar. Oh dearie. Over here. The man said, speaking over Oliver. He can't see us, only you can. Now if you don't mind, we're actually on a bit of a tight schedule. Deliverance looked back at Oliver, who had finished talking with no indication he knew someone had been talking over him. Something was very wrong, but if Oliver couldn't see these people and help, then he was in the way. Time for some bullshit acting. Oliver, I'm sorry. Can I have a minute? Like alone? I don't know what happened, but maybe we can try again once I sort of ground myself a bit. Okay? She did her best rendition of a doe-eyed look, and of course it immediately worked. Oliver took her hand and kissed her softly on the cheek. Take all the time you need. I'll step outside for a few minutes and then we'll try again. He walked out of the door, closing it behind him, and Deliverance whirled on the smoke guys. She glared at the guy in gray, fairly confident he was the one in charge. Explain, she spoke through gritted teeth. The man in gray clasped his hands together, acting as if he was taking part in a pleasant chat between colleagues. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Koi Sepala. And who are they? Kleinsteep, Rafaru, Ian Fem and Ted Ha. He gestured to each of the other men, who nodded at Deliverance when their names were said. She caught all of their movements in her periphery, deciding to keep her eyes locked on the guy in charge. Okay, Koi, whoever the fuck, now that I have your names, would you care to explain why you have mine? And maybe some context as to why you're here, and only I can see you. Koi laughed softly. Oh dear. A shit-eating grin spread his lips. You really don't know who we are. No shit, Sherlock. Okay, well, since we're rather pressed for time today, I'll aim for brevity. I am known by many names, and while I prefer Koi because it's easier to say for simple humans like yourself, you may more commonly know me as Apocalypse. And these gentlemen with me are my 4 horsemen. Chapter 12. Horsemen? Deliverance asked, incredulous. As in the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Koi looked a bit put out at her question. I had hoped you'd be quite a bit brighter, dear. Or did I stutter? He looked at the nearest horseman, who shrugged and threw a smirk in her direction. Deliverance gritted her teeth. For the sake of argument, let's say I believe you and you're trying to end the world or whatever. What does that have to do with me? Koi laughed. I thought you'd be a great deal more invested in the state of your world, considering that you have to live in it. But to address your woefully outdated misconception, he gestured at himself and his companions, aren't going to end your miserable little world and existence. We're simply going to crack the sloppy seals that are currently holding it together, and then sit back and watch it fall apart all on its own. Much less messy that way. Less tedious too. There are just so many of you. Koi shuddered delicately, and the horseman laughed smugly, making Deliverance have to double her efforts to keep her temper in check. Seals? What seals? Koi groaned. Pascal didn't tell me you'd be quite so dense. I'm disappointed, Deliverance, I really am. I also find that I'm growing tired of your questions. Mouth open, Deliverance tried to interrupt, but Koi waved his hand dismissively. We must be going anyway, said Koi, so we'll leave you to be boring and stupid all by yourself. Deliverance was fed up with this aristocratic bastard, and she straightened to her full height, trying to sound authoritative. Wait. I'm the one who summoned you, which means you can't leave until I release you, right? The horseman dressed in pale green barked a laugh and looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her torso. I don't know, Koi. She's got some fight in her. Can't we stay and play a while? Mortal flesh is such a treat. Klein, Koi sighed, we have a prior engagement, remember? But Koi. Enough, Deliverance yelled. I summoned you, which means you are bound to my circle. I will not release you until I have some answers, so start talking. You really think you can bind us, girl? The man in red said, an eyebrow raised mockingly. He took a step toward her, and Deliverance instinctively took a step back. She ran through her memories of all she had learned about circle casting, wishing she wasn't so new at this. Why did they have to gate crash my spell? I'm just a fledgling for fuck's sake. I'm nobody. The man in red took another step, prompting Deliverance to do the same. She felt the wall bump into her shoulder blades. The red guy continued his slow approach, and the color drained from her face. She had nowhere to go. Should I shout for Oliver? She then recalled no one could see them but her. Well, fuck. This is just great. Rafa. Koi said gently. Deliverance took a deep breath, then opened her mouth, ready to scream Oliver's name anyway. The horseman, Rafa, reached out and pressed a finger to her lips. He leaned forward to speak into her ear. I wouldn't do that if I were you. His whisper was gravelly, as if he had swallowed glass at some point and his throat had healed wrong. Deliverance made to push him away, but Rafa's other hand struck out and grabbed her wrist, gripping tightly as if grinding her bones together. She hated the whimper that escaped with her exhaled breath, but she hated the satisfaction on Rafa's face even more. Forget everything you think you know, young fledgling. Speaking quietly, Rafa's eyes burned into hers. We're smarter than you. We're stronger than you. You'll be crushed into dust, alongside all the others, and no one will remember you. Just like your mother. Rafa, Koi snapped, causing the red horseman to release her hand and straighten. Rafa spared her a cruel smile, and then walked back to where he originally appeared from his red column of smoke. Koi followed Rafa's progress, ensuring he was back to standing in line, and then turned his attention to Deliverance. Rafa is rather fond of dramatics, but everything he said is quite true. We will break the seals, and we will enjoy watching your world reduced to ashes. As for your summoning spell, my dear, you didn't actually summon us, did you? Sure, we tagged along with your familiar, but we aren't bound in any way to your adorable little circle. We'll be in touch. Koi winked, then snapped his fingers, and the 5 men dissolved back into smoke that quickly dissipated, leaving Deliverance alone in the practicum chamber, shaken to her core. Chapter 13. What the fuckity fuck was that shitshow? She shook her head, not sure what to make of the situation. Did I hit my head or something? This shit can't be real, she whispered more to herself than anything else. But deep down, somehow, she knew it was real. And the fact the Red Horseman, who evidently likes the name Rafa, had mentioned her mother just solidified that what she had just witnessed was indeed real, leaving her totally fucked. Somehow she had summoned the horseman and Koi, whatever the fuck his name was, during her spellcasting endeavor. Or did she? What did he say? She mulled over the conversation, replaying it over and over again in her mind. They hitched a ride on the spell. Hitching a ride wasn't something covered in class, and she sure as hell didn't know enough about magic to form a strong opinion on the matter. Fuck. What does that even mean? There really wasn't anything in her prior lessons, present or the ones she had crammed into her brain to get caught up on, that alluded to the fact that Hell's minions could hitch a ride on a spell cast for finding one's familiar. She needed answers, not more riddles, puzzles, and questions. There was a quiet knock on the practicum chamber door. Knock. 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 Deliverance jumped, only relaxing when she saw Oliver peering into the room. Hey. There you are. You doing okay? He asked, apparently oblivious to everything that had just happened. Yep. As good as a girl with a failed spell can be. Laughter erupted from her lips, making her sound like a basket case even to her ears. It's not as if I've unleashed hell on earth or anything. More nervous laughter followed. Damn. I gotta get a grip. Ready to try again? He crossed the room, picked up a few supplies, then started rebuilding the circle. No. She shook her head, trying to clear thoughts of Koi and his colorful henchman from her thoughts. Not today, maybe never. You don't mean that. A frown hit his lips. No. I don't. I just need some time, I think. Confusion clouded her mind, and it didn't help that the prior conversation remained stuck on auto-repeat in her head. Okay, then when? Deliverance started gathering her things and shoving them into her backpack, hoping that keeping her hands busy would disguise their shaking. Maybe tomorrow. She didn't like feeling pressured, and right now casting another spell wasn't high on her list of priorities. You sure about that? Deliverance, you know I don't mind, right? His eyes took on a somber, soothing gaze. Hey. Don't be so hard on yourself. We still have the rest of our classes today, and I don't want to be late. Oliver nodded, shooting her a look of concern. Right, classes? Sure thing. We still have some time before the next period starts. Did you want to grab some food from the dining hall? Deliverance racked her brain for an excuse, but decided to stick with as much of the truth as she could. I'm actually going to see if I can catch Headmaster Helms before Latin. I'll, see you at dinner though. Oliver looked disappointed, but quickly plastered on a smile. Okay, yeah. I'll see you then. I'll just, head back to the classroom then. I'd walk you to the headmaster's office, but since I'm tall, I really have to get back. Deliverance hid her relief and nodded her thanks, then slipped past Oliver into the hallway. Small talk would have been a disaster, and she didn't want Oliver to think she was even more of a nutcase than she probably seemed to be. Walking quickly, her mind remained a maelstrom of thoughts, and one blew harder, so she decided that she would have to turn this over to the teachers. Dealing with the actual apocalypse wasn't exactly in the fledgling territory of feasibility, even though it bruised her pride a little bit. She approached the wing of the headmaster's office, hesitated but then straightened her shoulders and walked in with her head held high. She opened the door, strode inside. Damn it. An empty office met her with deafening silence. Chapter 14. Miss Mackey? Asked a voice behind her. Deliverance both jump and yelp in surprise. She whirled around and came face to face with Headmaster Helms. The super was holding a cup of hot, steaming tea. And like usual, he looking remarkably bored and uninterested. "Do you ever make sound when you move?" she asked, too disoriented for tact. "For fuck's sake, Petty. You should wear a bell or something." Headmaster Helms stared at her disapprovingly for a moment, before silently stepping around her and settling in behind his desk. "Is there a reason you're snooping around in my office, Miss Mackey? Especially when you could be working on important school work, such as spellcasting." "Snooping? I'm not snooping." She let out a long, heavy sigh. "I came to see you." "Yes. I can see that," he said. "But why still remains a mystery." "Something happened during a summoning spell." "All right," he interrupted, "and was this something witnessed by another student?" "Well, no, not really. Well, maybe just a... or perhaps witnessed by a faculty member." "No, but... so what? Do you believe that the walls have eyes? That they can corroborate your experience?" What? "Get on with it," he said. "Tell me why you're here." Deliverance felt her face flush, and she glared at the headmaster. "Look, headmaster, I'm trying to tell you something important here, something I think you really need to know. And again, the floor is all yours." He motioned with his hand. "Enlighten me, so to speak." "My summoning spell was crashed by the actual 4 horsemen of the literal apocalypse, and their mob boss or whatever. They said they're going to be breaking the 7 seals, and then..." "It sounds like you've been doing some reading during your time with us," Headmaster Helms said, easing back into sounding bored. "I'll admit, I didn't think the Bible would particularly interest you, given your time with the good sisters at the temple, but I'm sure they'd be much more interested in your reading choices than I am." Deliverance blinked. "You don't believe me?" She didn't phrase it as a question, but Headmaster Helms answered as if she had. "No, Ms. Mackey. I do not believe that you and you alone stumbled across a plot to unleash the apocalypse of Revelation." He leaned forward, placing his hands palms down on his desk, his violet eyes steadily holding hers. "Now, I do, however, believe that you're trying to get out of an agreement you made with the Academy without being executed, as have hundreds of students before you. Honestly, I'm surprised you waited this long to come and spin your story for me. The average is 3 days, and you stretched it out to 5. An exercise in patience for you, I'm sure." Deliverance gaped at him, her mouth working but no sound coming out. She couldn't believe it. "And this is why I didn't trust authority," she thought. "They're always writing my comments off and dismissing what I have to say." She closed her mouth with a clack of teeth and clenched her jaw. "Thank you for the insight, Headmaster Helms." She spoke through gritted teeth. "I'll leave you to your tea and your tacky Yoda collection." With that parting shot, she spun on her heel and swept out of his office. She expected him to call her back with a sarcastic reply, if nothing else, but the office remained silent up until the door swung shut behind her. Deliverance began her walk back to the classrooms, dreading the inevitable slog through her Latin lesson of the day. Even a cool vamp professor wouldn't be able to take her mind off the summoning spell gone awry. She knew she wasn't crazy, and that she hadn't imagined the whole exchange with Coy and his creepy sidekicks. It had obviously been a mistake to go to the headmaster, but it was one she vowed to never repeat. "If Coy wants to fuck with me specifically, then I'll fuck with him right back." It would take some research, and a ton of practice and preparation, but humiliation was a powerful motivator. She'd figure out what was really going on, and then she'd deal with it. Fledgling or not. Chapter 15. Deliverance made it through the rest of the day, on autopilot. Anytime anyone asked, she claimed her mind remained on schoolwork. Plus, she told Oliver it was fatigue when he repeatedly asked her what was wrong. He walked her back to her room as usual, but Deliverance quickly fished out her keys and went inside without loitering in the doorway. Deliverance. His voice sounded hollow, almost non-existent. Is this about what happened in the practicum chamber? She whirled around on him, ready to spin a web of interconnecting lies, but the look of hurt on his face made her take a moment to regroup. Oh man. Did he hear Koi and the horseman? Was this about that? If no, why would he have pretended to? Oh, I'm an idiot, she thought, somewhat embarrassed now. Damn. It's about what happened before the spell. The feel of his lips on hers, and the way their hips had fitted together came to mind, not to mention how his mouth on her neck had made her quiver. It's been a while since I allowed anyone in. She let out a long sigh. Can I trust him? More importantly, should I trust him? Oliver. She walked back to the doorway and looked into his copper eyes. This isn't about what happened between us. It was a weird day, and I'm tired, that's all. Are you sure? He ventured, reaching out to lace his fingers with hers. I know it was moving fast, It's okay, she assured him, squeezing his hand before letting go. Everyone has off days, right? Well, today was one of mine. I'm going to call it an early night. See if I can sleep off the weirdness, and tomorrow I'll be back to normal. He smiled tentatively, and Deliverance made a mental note to be more engaged the next day. She had been kind of a shitty friend today, and she had her reasons, but it still wasn't fair. Oliver stepped back out of her doorway, so that she had room to shut the door. We'll try the spell again tomorrow, okay? She nodded her agreement, gave him a small smile, and then closed the door to her room. Walking over to her bed, she sat down heavily, her breath whooshing out of her lungs. Tomorrow, she would figure out her plan of attack with the horseman. It would probably involve the library, and late nights, and more time in a practicum chamber, but she was determined to not be humiliated the next time they met. And she knew there would be a next time. She didn't know how she knew, but there was a reason they had crashed her spell. There had to be. On impulse, she pulled out her phone's note-taking app and created a new memo. She wrote down as many pieces of information she could remember, not wanting anything to slip her mind after a night of sleep. Koi Sepala, SP? Klein. Rafa. Ian. Ted. Apocalypse, Revelation? Bible? Seals? Pascal? My mom? She frowned at all the question marks, but she thought she had all the important stuff. Headmaster Helms had unwittingly given her a starting point for her reading material, the Book of Revelation in the Bible. The good sisters would flip if they knew I'd be reading the Bible voluntarily. A chuckle passed her lips. Deliverance tossed her phone on the nightstand, then flopped backward onto her bed. A muffled squeak accompanied her movement, and then she felt something moving underneath her jacket. What the? A yelp passed her lips and she jumped to her feet. Shimmying out of her jacket as quickly as possible, she threw it on the bed. She grabbed her nearest textbook and held it over her head, ready to squash whatever scurried out from her blazer. A small form moved beneath the fabric, and then a tiny pure black nose with equally black whiskers sniffed at the air cautiously. As she watched, a mouse emerged and clambered on top of her now disheveled jacket. It looked up at her, idly washing its face. Don't you dare move. Deliverance raised her textbook further above her head, ready to swing it down, but something made her hesitate. Chapter 16. What the hell, she whispered to herself. You're kind of cute, in a strange kind of way. She couldn't help her morbid curiosity. Deliverance didn't care for vermin as a general rule, but she had never seen a solid black mouse before. How the hell did you end up in my jacket, little dude? She murmured, unable to keep her eyes off him. I almost squished you. And now I'm talking to a mouse. Can today get any stranger? There was a pop of sparks, and then the mouse was gone. When the mini light show ended, A salamander, also just as black, swished its tail. Whoa. Deliverance blinked at the salamander. Guess I shouldn't have asked. The little guy walked around, licked his eye, and then froze in place. One of his front feet remained in the air. Because apparently it can, she said aloud. And this qualifies as being strange, super strange. She circled the bed, looking for the mouse. Okay, Whiskers, where did you go? The salamander turned its head to follow her movement. Seriously, where'd you go, little guy? There was no sign of the mouse. It was almost like the salamander used to be the mouse. That can't be right, can it? Deliverance pinched the bridge of her nose. Why is there a mouse/salamander in my room? Her temples throbbed. Why me? Just fucking why? Another pop, followed by two more, sounded. The sparks, near blinding, made her squeeze her eyes shut. When she opened them, there was a solid black finch staring at her, ruffling its wings. A mouse/salamander/finch. She scratched her head. Wait a second, Deliverance whispered, eyes wide as she watched the now finch picking at the fabric of her blazer. You're a changeling. But why? Wait. Are you my familiar? The finch chirped and fluttered its wings at her, what Deliverance imagined as the bird version of "took you long enough." Deliverance cautiously held out her hand, and the finch immediately flew up to perch on her thumb. Her little passenger weighed next to nothing. It cocked its head, appearing to study her, and then in another pop of sparks it was back to being a mouse. The guy cuddled into her hand and squeaked softly, making Deliverance giggle. Okay, buddy. I guess the spell worked after all. A changeling, how cool is that? The mouse squeaked again, then sneezed, making Deliverance laugh. Okay, don't get too full of yourself now. I think I'm going to call you Jet. How's that sound? In response, Jet snuggled against the palm of her hand, which Deliverance supposed was a good sign. She cupped Jet in her palms, placing him gently on her desk, then got into bed. There was a pop of sparks, and then a flying squirrel dive-bombed into her hair. Okay, fine, I'll share the bed. Deliverance sighed. But if I roll over in the night and squish you, it's not my fault. With a pop of sparks, Jet was back in mouse form. He squeaked at her before hopping onto her extra pillow, curling into a ball and promptly falling asleep. Deliverance rolled her eyes but grinned anyway. Her first spell had worked. Sure, it had also let her in on a scheme to end the world as she knew it, but the little mouse was proof that she wouldn't be facing it alone. She laid her head on her pillow and studied the ceiling in the fading light. Tomorrow's a new day. She would have to explain Jet to Oliver, but she was excited that she had proof she wasn't a total fuck-up with this whole magic stuff. Besides, having a shape-shifting familiar could be handy in exploring the school, and maybe even making it past the wards if she needed to. If her conversation with Petty Boy hadn't helped her with the horseman situation, it had certainly reminded her that the only person in this world she could trust was herself. A soft squeak of a snore rose, and she glanced at Jet once more. She felt as if she should pinch herself. Well, it's just you and me, buddy, she whispered, then covered him with the sheet. Just you and me. Chapter 17. Free at last. She let the words sink in. It was TGIF, thank God it's Friday, at the academy, which meant that spirits were high. A whole weekend without classes made the last day more bearable for students and faculty alike, and Deliverance had breezed through her classes. She showed Jet to both Oliver and Professor Renove, who were even more enthusiastic than she had anticipated. Actually, she wasn't sure what to expect when she had walked into class, but somehow, having the little guy with her boosted her confidence. Not sure how it happened, she thought with a grin. But I'm glad it did. Somehow she had done it. She had summoned her familiar. One kick-ass familiar, even if I say so myself. A grin spread her lips. Renove specifically was fascinated by her changeling familiar, and was practically beaming when she witnessed the pops of sparks as Jet transformed from one shape to the other. She and Oliver were more flirty than normal throughout the day, and Deliverance realized in shock that she was having fun with a boy at a school, a real boy. She actually felt kind of normal for once. It wouldn't last, of course, it never did for her. But hey, there was no harm in enjoying it while it lasted. At dinner, Oliver kept trying to hook his feet around her ankles, and after a few failed attempts to disentangle herself, Deliverance gave up and just let their legs be pretzeled together. As Deliverance was experimenting with what foods Jet would and wouldn't eat, Oliver snapped his fingers. She looked up, and Jet took the opportunity to snag a French fry off her plate. "I almost forgot," Oliver exclaimed excitedly. "This is your first weekend at the academy. I don't know if anyone told you, but the students usually head into the nearest town to hang out on Saturdays. There's a curfew and we have chaperones, but..." "Wait, we get to go outside the wards?" Deliverance asked. "Every weekend." Oliver grinned. "Yep, every Saturday. And weekends don't require uniforms. We get to wear street clothes." Deliverance laughed. "God, finally. I only have the clothes I arrived in though. Please, please, please tell me there are places to shop for clothes in this dreamy destination town outside the stupid wards?" Oliver nodded, feeding Jet another French fry from his plate. "They have some cool stores in a strip mall. Lexi would always drag me through when she went clothes shopping. But hey, I can still go with you, I don't mind, I just..." "Oliver, I'm not cruel, you don't have to endure clothes shopping with me." Deliverance stuck her tongue out before continuing. "If you just point me in the right direction, and I get normal clothes at long fucking last, then I will be eternally grateful." "Eternally grateful, you say?" Oliver waggled his eyebrows, making Deliverance laugh. "Yes, you heard me. Now, can I have my feet back so that we can go? I want to get some fresh weekend air, to purge the school week from immediate memory." Oliver relinquished his hold on her feet, and Jet zapped back into his finch form so that he could perch on her shoulder. Oliver returned both his tray and hers, and as soon as they were outside, Jet took to the air and became a tiny black speck against the clouds. She and Oliver walked together, their fingers brushing each other's with each stride, taking the circuitous route back to Deliverance's room. "I wish Tasha was small and calm like Jet," Oliver said with a sigh. "You said she's a fire drake, right? How big is she exactly?" Deliverance asked, with a touch of curiosity. Oliver held his hands about 2 feet apart. "She's like a winged puppy that's covered in scales, and loves to literally play with fire. I had to get fireproof dust covers for my textbooks because she kept singeing the pages." Deliverance laughed. She thought it would be cool to have a kinda dragon thingy as a familiar, but the more time she spent with Jet, the more their bond felt right. He was sneaky, and had a bit of an attitude problem, which meant they got along wonderfully. Chapter 18. "So how was it? How did your classes go today?" Oliver walked up the steps to the dorms, keeping pace next to her. "Okay." "Just okay?" he asked. She held the door to the building open for him, and once they crossed the threshold, she waited until it clicked in place. "Well?" He held her gaze. "Well, what? Was it just okay or what?" "Better than usual, I guess." She let out a sigh. Having the little guy kind of helped. Back at Deliverance's room, she and Oliver loitered in the hallway as usual. "So, are you learning any Latin?" He pulled her closer to himself. "Not as much as Professor Vamp would like." A smirk spread her lips. They kept finding excuses to be touching each other, and like before, with each touch a spark of energy ignited and buzzed between them, leaving her to wonder if he felt it too. "Well, like I said, he's had decades to practice." He brushed a stray sand out of her face, and his fingers caressed her cheek in the process. "Yeah, guess being undead worked out well for him." She brushed imaginary lint off his shoulder. Then a thought occurred to her. "So I'm curious, did he need permission to enter the school grounds, the buildings? Is that whole, you must invite a vampire to enter even a thing?" "Actually, yes." He nodded, running the tips of his fingers down the flesh of her arms, which at his touch erupted in goosebumps. Her reaction, his touch, didn't go unnoticed to his eyes. Deliverance couldn't stop giggling. She knew she was making a fool of herself, but she couldn't bring herself to care. It was fun, and it made her internment at the school easier to bear. Plus, for the first time in her life, she felt as if she belonged. Sure, she was still a freak, but this time she was a freak within freaks. She was among her freakish peers. Jet took their closeness as an opportunity to be in his flying squirrel form, bounding between their shoulders to catch some air and glide time. A few times he barely avoided a collision with the wall or a face, hers and Oliver's. Seems like someone needs to practice his landing. Oliver tried to stifle a laugh by turning it into a cough. They gradually increased the distance between them, so that Jet could practice gliding. A few times he miscalculated and had to scrabble and cling to their clothing to keep from falling, which made Oliver and Deliverance both laugh. Deliverance was toying with the idea of inviting Oliver inside, imagining what might happen behind another closed door. Am I ready to take things to the next level? She mused, then caught sight of swirling skirts down the hallway. Great. First the good OL sisters at the temple pined over trying to save my virtue, and now here comes Renove. What is Professor Renove doing in the dorms? And why was she heading this way? Oliver turned to follow Deliverance's line of sight, and looked as confused as she felt. The professor flounced over, and looked between them knowingly. Oliver, good to see you. May I borrow Deliverance for a moment? Oliver shot her a quizzical glance before nodding. Sure, Professor. Deliverance, I'll see you tomorrow. The buses leave at 9, so I'll come get you around 8:30. Deliverance's fantasy of having some alone time with him in her room tonight vanished into thin air, and she sighed. Yeah, I'll see you in the morning. Jet zapped back into a mouse and squeaked from her shoulder. That is, we will see you in the morning. Oliver grinned and gave a small wave, then pulled out his phone and headed down the hall, tapping away at the screen. Seriously, whenever they weren't actively talking, that boy was constantly glued to his phone. May I come in? Renove asked once Oliver was out of earshot. Okay. Deliverance walked inside, leaving the door open for the professor to follow. Jet zapped into his finch form, and flew to her desk where he perched on top of her lamp. He tilted his head to study Renove, seemingly wary of the visit, just like Deliverance. Chapter 19. The professor stood by the door with her hands clasped behind her back, looking around the bare room with interest. I wanted to check in with you, Deliverance, before tomorrow's weekly outing into town. Deliverance's heart sank. The memory of arriving in handcuffs, and her extra rules as a Class 5 super came crashing back into her mind. She hadn't even considered that her limited freedom might be reduced yet again. Jet seemed to sense her agitation, and zapped into his flying squirrel form, hurriedly gliding across the room to her and climbing up to sit on her shoulder. As a Class 5 blood witch, Renove said, it is mandatory for you to be accompanied outside of the wards. Deliverance released a breath she didn't know she had been holding. So I get to go? Renove nodded. Yes, however, you must have a chaperone, and cannot leave that person's sight. I know it's intrusive, but I'm afraid there is nothing I can do about the matter. As such, I have volunteered to be your chaperone. You, really? Renove drew herself up, looking stoic. I know we didn't get off on the right foot, and so I understand that you may not be happy with the situation, but given that your other option would have been a school guard, I decided to step in. That's... Deliverance paused, surprised at the professor's gesture. Thank you, Professor. Renove blinked, apparently not expecting that response. Right. Well, I suppose I'll see you and Oliver in the morning. And Jet, of course. Deliverance smiled. Yes. Of course. Renove turned to go but hesitated, then spun back around. May I ask you a question? Deliverance was wary, but nodded for her to continue. Have you told Oliver that you're a Class 5 super? She shook her head, blushing. I was already the new kid. I didn't want to be different, for yet another reason. Renove nodded thoughtfully. That information is yours to do with as you wish, so I will try to craft a separate excuse for why I must accompany you all day. Perhaps I could say that I'm studying Jet." Before Deliverance could answer, Jet leaped from her shoulder and glided towards Professor Renove. The professor quickly reached out her cupped hands to catch him. He circled the professor a few times, before looking back at Deliverance pointedly. Deliverance had to laugh, and she grinned despite herself. "We both would appreciate that very much. Jet is a bit of a show-off, as I'm sure you've noticed, so he would probably love the extra attention." Renove smiled down at Jet, and Deliverance thought that Oliver maybe had been right about the professor. She was super granola and Wiccan and a stickler for rules, but maybe she wasn't so bad after all. Lifting her hands above her head, the professor gave Jet more altitude, and he squeaked happily as he launched himself from her hands to glide back to Deliverance. She caught him, then tossed him towards the bed so that he could curl up on her pillow. She heard a zap that probably meant he was back in his mouse form, which seemed to be his favorite to sleep in. "Right?" Renove clapped her hands together, as she did after a lecture in class. "I will see you in the morning. I'll meet you by the bus, so that Oliver can retrieve you as planned, and then we'll go into town." A fun-filled day out was just what she needed. Maybe she could even have a regular meal. A burger would be nice. "Maybe I can spring for one." A sigh left her lips. "With what money, you idiot?" Professor, is there any?" "Perhaps there's a spell for that," she mused. "A spell to create cash. Spit the words out, you'll feel better. Where do students get? How do they make money if they don't have parents or an allowance?" The sisters wouldn't give her dime, that much she knew. "Ah, I see your dilemma. Have no fear, the Continuum provides a monthly stipend for each student dependent on need, of course." Professor Renove winked. "You'll receive a credit line to obtain items you need, clothing, food, furniture for Jet and his many forms." "Okay, Professor. Just so you know, I'll be clothes shopping tomorrow." A wave of excitement swelled inside her. "It's an endurance sport, so wear comfy shoes." "Is this what it feels like to be almost normal?" "I look forward to it." Renove huffed a laugh and turned for the door. She went into the hallway, but before she pulled the door shut behind her, she gave Deliverance a wry smile. "The only upside of living as long as I have is that you learn where all the best shopping is. I'll see you in the morning, Ms. Mackey. Good night." With that, the professor pulled the door closed and Deliverance was left in her room alone, smiling. She and Renove certainly weren't friends, but Deliverance thought they might be tentative allies. She turned to where Jet was pretending to be asleep on her pillow, his twitching whiskers the only indication that he was actually awake. "You're a drama queen, Jet," Deliverance said quietly, her hands on her hips. Jet cracked one eye open and she rolled her eyes at him. She climbed into bed and thought about what the next day would bring. A trip outside the wards, new clothes, time with Oliver in town even though it would be chaperoned, and then maybe, just maybe, time with Oliver in her room when they got back with no chaperones. "Jet?" She grinned in the fading light and curled up under the covers. "Tomorrow's gonna be interesting indeed." He squeaked in agreeance. Chapter 20. Wake up, sleepyhead. Deliverance glanced at Jet, who remained snuggled on her pillow. Excitement about the trip outside the wards practically launched her out of bed at the crack of dawn. She had hurriedly dressed in her normal clothes and gave herself a once-over in the bathroom mirror. She looked and felt like herself for the first time in a week. As she waited for Oliver, she passed the time by playing with Jet in his many forms. So far he could become a salamander, a finch, a flying squirrel, and of course the mouse form he seemed to be so fond of. She fed him some crackers from her closet stash of food, and then he looked at the door and squeaked a couple of times. A knock echoed in the room. Apparently, his hearing's much better than mine. "That's a neat trick, Jet," she said softly. "It could definitely come in handy." She stood and carefully scooped up Jet to place him on her shoulder, then opened the door to find Oliver in normal clothes as well. He pulled off the bookish uniform look well, but jeans and a long-sleeved flannel suited him much better. Oliver looked her up and down, then whistled approvingly. Damn, Deliverance. No wonder you were so eager to wear something other than our uniforms. Deliverance grinned, shrugging her shoulders and making Jet squeak with her movement. She knew she looked good in her street clothes, which was why she preferred the style. Distressed jeans, a low-cut tank top with a print of heart beating inside a ribcage, her favorite cropped jacket with brass buttons on the lapels, and a layered necklace she had inherited from her mother. It was the only thing her mother had ever given her, other than her inherited powers as a blood witch. Professor Renove would have a heart attack if she saw you wearing this, Oliver joked, reaching out to scratch behind Jet's mouse ears. Deliverance's focus zoomed in on Oliver's hand so close to her face, and his arm stilled as he appeared to become aware of their proximity as well. There was a long, tense moment, filled with crackling energy between them. Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form and launched himself at Oliver, breaking the spell between them. Oliver scrambled to keep Jet from falling, and both Deliverance and Oliver awkwardly laughed off the tension. Deliverance grabbed her bag before following Oliver into the hall, and hand in hand, they started heading down toward where the buses would be waiting. Hopefully Renove can handle my outfit, Deliverance said, because she'll be coming with us today. Oliver nodded. Yeah, she's usually one of the chaperones, but once we're in town we can ditch her. Deliverance decided she needed to clarify before they reached the bus, sticking to the professor's idea the night before. Actually, she'll be specifically with me. She said she wants to observe Jet today, and I told her that would be okay. Oliver gave her a sideways look, raising one eyebrow. I'm surprised you're so okay with the professor tagging along. Surely she can observe Jet during the week? Probably, but I already agreed to today. Guess I'm stuck with her. Deliverance was pleased with her half-truth, and Oliver's quick acceptance of it. She wasn't sure what next weekend's excuse would have to be, but that was future Deliverance's problem. She stepped outside and descended the stairs toward the waiting buses. Professor Renove raised a hand to flag her and Oliver down. There you are, Renove said by way of greeting. We're on this first bus. Oh, and Jet is with you, yes? Deliverance coaxed Jet out from under the lapel of her jacket. Yep, he's right here, superglue style. I told Oliver you were going to be observing him today. Renove caught her eye and gave a small nod, then turned to Oliver. Yes, that's right. And I hear we will be clothes shopping today, yes? Oliver groaned. I will most definitely not be clothes shopping. I'll leave that to the experts. He winked at Deliverance, then climbed aboard the bus. Renove hesitated before following, looking at Deliverance with a knowing gleam in her eye. Deliverance rolled her eyes and slipped around the professor to board the bus. They may be tentative allies, but she was not about to discuss her building relationship with Oliver with Renove. Girl talk had never appealed to Deliverance, but especially not with a professor. Chapter 21. Professor Renove. Deliverance laughed, holding her stomach. You weren't kidding when you claimed to know the best places to shop. It had been a long time since she had laughed so much. Well, ever since her mother's death. This is nice for a change, that is. I've been around a few times. The professor casually browsed through a circular rack of long, flowing skirts. And I've seen a thing or two, or three. Wonder how many of those she has. The professor had taken Deliverance and Jet on a tour of several small stores, some of them virtually hidden. And over time, Deliverance had accumulated bags of new clothes that she was happy with. But now, instead of shopping, she found herself enjoying the older woman's company. Something she hadn't thought possible. Is this what it's like to be seen, to be normal? She wasn't used to conversing with people like this, and certainly not with adults who taught her. Back at the temple, the sisters never spoke this openly with her. But then again, they also feared her and what she could do. The professor didn't seem the least bit bothered by her magical abilities, or the lack of her control of those so-called gifts. Hell, even I fear what I can do, and I don't have the foggiest idea of the shit I can do. She sighed. But I do know one thing, I sure as shit can unleash the 4 horsemen and their ringleader. When Oliver originally left them to start shopping, the interaction between her and Renove had been awkward to say the least. But soon, they met on common ground and Jet became the dominant topic of discussion. In no time at all, she and the professor were talking comfortably and laughing at Jet's antics. Time flew by disappointingly fast, and soon enough, they were being herded back onto the buses to be shuttled back to the academy. Deliverance snagged a window seat and balanced her shopping bags on her lap so that Oliver had room to sit beside her, and Renove took the seat immediately behind them. As they drove away from the town, Deliverance gazed longingly at the buildings until they were gone from her view, courtesy of the road's twists and turns. As they pulled onto the academy's drive and passed through the warded gates, Deliverance sighed. Back in my cage for another week, like a good little blood witch. Jet zapped into his mouse form and scurried under her jacket lapel, squeaking softly in response to her change in mood. The bus drew to a stop, and everyone started to file out, but Deliverance hung back. Partially because her shopping bags were unwieldy, but mostly because she was reluctant to get off the bus. Outside of the wards, she had felt a weight lifted from her shoulders, and having to carry it again after a day of precious freedom was incredibly uncomfortable. Oliver waited with her, and when almost everyone had cleared out, he finally stood and offered her his hand. Sorry that we didn't have much alone time today. She avoided his gaze. Don't worry about. There'll be other Saturdays. Hey, I can help carry your stuff back to your room, he said. Jet may be a talented changeling, but I don't think he has a pack horse in his repertoire just yet. Jet gave what Deliverance interpreted as an offended squeak, making them both laugh. Deliverance handed Oliver two of the heavier bags, and when their fingers brushed together on the handoff, she remembered her thoughts from the night before. The town had been amazing for a ton of different reasons, but the one thing it didn't have was something her room could readily provide: privacy. She stepped off the bus, followed by Oliver, then Renove. The professor turned to them and nodded, sharing a smile with Deliverance. Thank you for letting me observe Jet today, Ms. Mackey. I hope you two enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you first thing Monday morning. I had fun, Professor. Thanks for your help and for showing me the best shops. See ya. Deliverance bid Renove farewell and started up the steps to the dorm. Chapter 22. Sounds like the professor knew all the cool spots, said Oliver with a broad smile. I'd say. Deliverance nodded in agreement. I don't think I've been out this much in, well, forever. She chatted idly with Oliver about the day, recounting the various things she had seen in the shops. Jet fluttered above them in his finch form, riding on the wind currents. Soon enough, they arrived at Deliverance's dorm. She set her bags down so that she could grab her keys. Thanks for helping me carry these. She unlocked her door and swung it open. I had a really great time today. Oliver's smile stretched even wider. Even with Professor Renove tagging along. Nothing could have ruined today, Deliverance said with a laugh. Not even the professor. She paused a moment to reflect. It felt so good to be outside the wards. Headmaster Helms could have been lurking around, and I probably would have still managed to enjoy the day. Now that's impressive. Oliver's eyebrows climbed up his forehead. They laughed, and Deliverance carried her set of bags inside by her closet door. She would put her new clothes away later. When she turned around, Oliver was still standing in the hallway. Well, I guess I should. Oliver looked shy, which surprised her. Here you go. He held the bags out for her to take. Oh, She decided to take a chance. Do you want to come in? You only live once, right? She held her breath, waiting for his response. Oliver hesitated for just a moment, then said, Sure. I'd like that. He crossed the threshold and placed the bags in his hands on the floor with the others. Deliverance walked back to the door and closed it, then turned around and locked eyes with him. There was a charged beat of silence, and then he tentatively crossed the room to where she stood with her back against the door. He reached out to take hold of her hand, lacing their fingers together, and she responded by tugging him closer until they were sharing a single breath. He tilted his head down, his lips mere inches from hers, and then whispered, "Is this okay?" In response, she closed the distance between them and they kissed. She lifted her free hand to cup the back of his neck, pulling him closer, kneading him closer, and he leaned against her so that they were both pressed against the door. Her tongue snaked into his mouth, and he groaned softly, making Deliverance's pulse spike. He reached up to where she had a hold on his neck, and maneuvered them so that he held both of her hands. With their fingers tightly intertwined, he pushed the backs of her hands against the door and lifted them above her head. His mouth left hers to trace a line down her jaw and neck. The contact made her gasp. His hips ground against her, and Deliverance broke her hands free so that she could wrap her arms around his neck. Oliver's hands explored her body, tracing down her sides, then he pulled them closer together. They both came up for air at the same time, and their eyes locked. The undercurrent of energy that had been surging between them hit an all-time high. She stilled, panting slightly, still pressed against him. A silent question swam inside Oliver's copper-colored eyes, and Deliverance tugged at the hem of his shirt. He lifted his arms above his head slowly, gathering the fabric in his hands and giving her time to tell him to stop, but that was the absolute last thing Deliverance wanted. She was burning with desire, and she hoped he could see the fire in her eyes the way she could see it glimmering in his. In one smooth motion, he pulled the shirt over his head and dropped it on the floor at her feet. Taking her time now, she lifted her hands to the sides of his neck, tracing her fingertips down across the smooth skin of his chest and stomach. Her hands settled at his hips, and she dragged her gaze back to his eyes. They were practically smoldering, looking more metallic than usual in the fading light, and the question remained. Are you sure? Chapter 23. Hey, it's my turn now. Just as slowly as Oliver had, she crossed her arms to grab the hem of her own shirt. Twisting to pull it over her head, she left her upper body bare except for her black bra. His eyes raked across her skin, and she shivered with anticipation. It had been a while since she'd been with someone, and in truth, she found herself both nervous and excited at the same time. His fingers fumbled on her back, trying to release the latch of her bra. "Is this thing enchanted?" he asked under his breath. After a few more tries, his face grew ruddy. Even the tips of his ears turned a crimson shade of red. Seeing him blush pulled a smile across her lips, and she suppressed a laugh. "I got this." She winked, then reached behind her back and unclasped her bra. Slowly, she let it fall to the floor. The garment joined the growing pile of clothes. Enchantment and all. A grin played on her lips. "So it was enchanted?" he asked with a playful chuckle. "Sure." This time she did laugh. "Why not? Everything else tucked snug behind the magical gates contains some form of magic or enchantment, so why not my bra?" Another wink his way made his ears turn red once more. She wrapped her arms back around Oliver's neck once again, and pressed their chests together hard against soft. His hands traveled over her shoulder blades, then followed the curve of her spine down to her lower back. She kissed him again, unhurried, and luxuriated in the feel of his hands on her. Arching her back, she simultaneously pressed her hips to his, then leaned back to give him easier access to her breasts. "You're beautiful," he whispered. His fingertips brushed over her nipples in an unhurried fashion, making them instantly harden. He cupped her breasts, thumbs working her nipples in gentle circles, and she pressed their foreheads together, moaning softly. He captured the sound with another kiss, and she let her fingers tangle in his hair. She tugged at his belt loops, and they stumbled away from the door toward the bed, still pressed together and exploring each other's skin. Backed against the bed, the mattress hit the backs of his knees, forcing him to sit, then she climbed onto his lap. Arms around her waist, he held her in place. She grabbed onto his shoulders for support, and he bent his head to one of her breasts. She arched her back into it and threw her head back, giving him full access. The wetness of his tongue playing with her nipples, first one then the other. He began sucking, then gently biting with his teeth. A moan rose from her lips, and her hips began to move against him. She could feel his hardness beneath her, and she rocked into him, giving just enough friction to let him know she wanted more. He gave one last gentle bite, making her gasp once more, and then he lifted his head so that their mouths could crash back together. She pushed at his shoulders, and he laid back on the bed, leaving her straddling his hips and looking down at him. His lips were swollen from kissing, as hers probably were, and she fanned out her fingers against his abdomen. He propped himself up on his elbows, dragging his gaze away from her bare torso to meet her eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked breathlessly, finally giving voice to the silent question he had been asking with his eyes. "Oh yeah." She nodded, then climbed off his lap to start taking off her jeans. "This is the only thing at the moment that I am sure about." He stood quickly and rid himself of the rest of his clothing as well, and in only few minutes they were both naked and pressed back together while standing. She laid down on the bed, and he knelt between her legs, spreading them, then braced her knees with his own. His hand skimmed the skin of her thighs, moving down toward her hips, until he finally reached between her legs and started massaging her clit. She groaned at his touch, arching her back for a better angle, and reached behind her to grab the headboard. Chapter 24. The skillful touch of his fingers moved deliciously, agonizingly slow, and she began to rock her hips, keeping in beat with his touch. More. She needed more from him. A connection that made her feel alive, real, seen, and needed. As if reading her body language, he brought his other hand between her legs, sliding a finger through her wet folds, and then plunged the same finger inside her while his thumb circled her clit. The sensation sent her hips flying off the bed. "Whoa now." Without missing a stroke, he eased her back down, then pinned her legs to the mattress. "Try and relax." She was already wet from the intense make-out session, but when he began moving his finger inside her and then added a second, she felt her legs start to tremble. He quickened his movements, finding a steady rhythm with her. Bowing his head, his warm breath blew over her skin. "I want to taste you." His whispered words found her ears and sent electric shivers through her body. Her past sexual experience with the fumbler who didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground had her hoping, no, wishing, that there was more to sex than grunts and friction. And so far Oliver had made great strides in making her wish come true. Sure, she'd made herself cum before, but if everything she'd ever heard or read was true, she wanted to feel that big oh moment with a sexual partner. He withdrew his fingers, spread her lips, and then with the tip of his tongue he teased the sensitive skin everywhere around the erect nub of her clit, ignoring one throbbing part that yearned for his touch. After several wet hot passes, he flicked her clit with tongue, causing the throb to deepen. Her breaths grew quick and shallow. When his lips closed around her clit and he sucked, she felt herself rushing toward a climax. "I'm close." She gripped the headboard even tighter. His fingers worked relentlessly, and she began panting, riding the crest of her impending orgasm, and then Oliver's hands disappeared. She looked up to find him tearing open a condom wrapper, and she kept her eyes on him, her gaze greedily drinking in the sight of him on top of her. "We're really doing this. Right now and here in my room." His hands quickly returned to her, teasing her clit again for a few moments, then they moved to her knees and pressed her legs wider. She lifted her hips, and then he was pushing himself inside of her, which made gasp. The stretch felt amazing, and when he started moving inside her, she rocked her hips to match his pace. He braced himself on his forearms while thrusting deep into her, kissing her hard while she clung to him. She arched her back, the change in angle and friction picking her climax back up where his fingers had left off, and she cried out when the full force of her orgasm crashed into her. After a few more strokes, Oliver's rhythm slowed, and he pushed deep inside her, shuddering with his own release. The waves of her orgasm slowly subsided, and she sagged under Oliver, wrapping her shaking legs around him, and letting her head fall back against the pillow. She draped her arms around his neck and he kissed her slowly, both of them spent. Carefully, he leaned back and pulled out of her, and she moaned at the sudden emptiness. Oliver shifted his weight and stretched out next to her on the bed. Wiggling around, she lifted her head so that his arm could wrap around her shoulders. She laid her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat while their breathing returned to normal. He lazily traced a pattern against her shoulder, and Deliverance sighed contentedly. She propped her chin on his chest and looked up at him, finding his eyes closed and a small smile on his lips. She smiled too, and laid her head back down against his chest. Hooking a leg over one of his, she curled into him and let the sound of his strong, steady heartbeat lull her to sleep. Chapter 25. Deliverance woke up with a mouse in her hair and sleep in her eyes. Jet squeaked in her ear, and she groggily cracked one eye open to a dark room. Her brain was foggy, and it took her several seconds to realize that she was tangled in warm limbs that weren't her own. Oliver. She smiled sleepily at the memory of them sleeping together, and blinked a few times to clear her eyes, then rubbed the sleep out of them. Jet? She murmured softly. Can you turn on my desk lamp? A small pop of sparks flashed inside the dark room. Jet in his finch form took off in flight. His wings flapped and she followed the sound to her desk. With a firm peck of his beak at the switch of her lamp, it turned on. The small light was practically blinding in the otherwise dark room, and Deliverance squinted her eyes, waiting for them to adjust. She turned back to look at Oliver, and saw that he was beginning to rouse because of the light. She carefully disentangled herself, and sat up on the mattress. Her muscles felt twitchy, and she was sore between her legs, but she felt good. Great even. She stretched her arms above her head and arched her spine, which resulted in a series of small pops that made her sigh in relief. The mattress moved, a direct result of Oliver stirring, and then his hand tugged on her arm. She turned to look at him, and he was squinting against the light just as she had moments ago. Come here, he said, his voice rough with sleep. She obliged, turning so that she was the little spoon and snuggled into Oliver's chest. His arm wrapped around her stomach, pulling her close, and she felt him drop a kiss onto the top of her head. What time is it? Oliver asked, his voice a bit clearer. No clue, she answered with a small shrug. She laid her arm over his and laced their fingers together. It looks dark out still, so I think we only slept for a few hours. He grunted in acknowledgement, then sighed into her hair. Deliverance felt safe like this, wrapped in Oliver's arms, and she wondered aloud, what now? It was his turn to shrug, the movement carrying through them both, close as they were. I don't know. I want to keep spending time with you, if that's what you're asking. Deliverance was pleased with his answer and smiled, even though he couldn't see it. What about Lexi? Oliver huffed. What about her? She and I are through, there's nothing left there. You have nothing to worry about. Deliverance didn't think that was quite true, having been on the receiving end of many of Lexi's death glares during the past week, but if Oliver said they were over, she would just have to trust him. In reality, she wasn't all that good at trusting people, but the truth of the matter was that she wanted to be with Oliver. Besides, she thought, I can handle a crazy ex-girlfriend. But she needed to hear it from Oliver, that extra reassurance, and she didn't know how to ask for it. He pulled her close and spoke into her hair. I want to be with you, Deliverance. If you'll have me. Good answer, she thought to herself. I'll have you, she said instead. I want to be with you too. Jet flew back to the bed and zapped into his mouse form. He scampered to where their hands were joined, and prodded them with his nose until they made room for him, then curled up against their hands and squeaked happily. Deliverance decided that Jet liking Oliver was a good sign. Okay, she said. Jet says you can stay. Oliver laughed softly and scratched behind Jet's mouse ears. Solid wingman move, thanks buddy. Deliverance giggled, feeling ridiculous, and she felt Oliver kiss her shoulder. She wanted to stay like this forever, but her bladder had other plans. She lifted Oliver's arm from her waist and sat up, scooting to the edge of the bed. Come back. He reached for her once again. She liked how he looked in her bed. Bathroom, she said by way of explanation. Sorry. Nature calls. Chapter 26. When she was done and washing her hands, she regarded her reflection. She had major sex hair, the fiery red strands looking more like a bird's nest than anything, and her lips were swollen. She grinned at the mirror, but then she watched her face fall. The truth hit her hard. She had forcefully entered the academy sure that she would just push to graduate as fast as possible, in and out, no attachments. But now she had Oliver. If her exploring the grounds resulted in her finding a ready path for an escape to freedom, would she be able to take that chance? Can I really leave behind this new life that I'm actually enjoying? Is being out of a cage worth being totally alone? She shook her head and sighed. She would have to play it by ear, with Oliver and with the school. Oh, and with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, plus Koi. Her mood considerably darker than when she first woke up. Deliverance plastered on a smile on her face, and then returned to her room and Oliver. She found him sitting on the edge of her bed, his jeans already on and shrugging back into his shirt from the previous day. He looked up and paused mid-movement, smiling. "Hey there, sunshine," he said. "What's the plan for the day?" She grinned, her smile coming easier now. Deliverance liked that Oliver was acting normal, instead of shy or nervous. Walking over to her shopping bags from where they had been forgotten by the closet, she knelt to rifle through her new clothes and pick out something to wear. One more day of street clothes, and then it would be back to her wretched uniform, so she was determined to enjoy every second. "Well," she said, talking while she gathered clothes, "the first step is taking a shower." "You really did a number on my hair." He grinned. "I'd say that I'm sorry, but I'm not. Besides, sex hair looks good on you." She stuck out her tongue. "It looks like a bird's nest, but thanks for the effort." Holding her clothes in her arms, she walked over to him, then leaned down to kiss him just because she could. He kissed her back, but there was none of the relentless heat of earlier. This kiss was sweet and sleepy, and Deliverance wasn't sure which she honestly preferred. "What are you going to do today?" She straightened so that she could meet his copper eyes. "Also shower," he said. "But after that, I don't know. Do you want to grab breakfast at the dining hall? They open at 6, but since it's a weekend, it'll be pretty much empty." "What time is it now?" "About 4:30. Deliverance groaned. 4:30 is an awful time to be awake. But since we're already up, we may as well beat the rush for breakfast. I don't know about you, but I'm starving. I mean, we did technically have a workout." Oliver gave her a wink that made her start giggling again. "Yep, I'm seriously sleep deprived." "Okay." She turned toward the bathroom and talked over her shoulder. "Shower, breakfast, and then probably another few hours of sleep." "Okay," Oliver echoed. She heard the mattress move when he stood, and when she had set her clothes down, she turned to look at him one last time. He was adorable in his rumpled clothes, and he had sex hair too. "It's only fair," she thought smugly. "I'll see you in a little bit," she said, one hand on the doorknob. "You'll come get me?" "I'll come get you," he reassured her. "See you in a bit." Deliverance gave him one last smile, then closed the door. As she set out her clothes and grabbed a towel, she heard Oliver leave her room and close the door behind him. She looked in the mirror, and saw that goofy grin of hers again. Maybe having an attachment to the academy wasn't so bad after all. "I'll figure it out." She reached into the shower and turned it on. Once steam began filling the bathroom, she stepped under the water and tilted her head back to let it start working through her hair. The water felt good, cleansing in more ways than one, and she imagined all of her worries and fears washing away and circling down the drain, leaving her clean and new. Chapter 27. At breakfast, Deliverance sat with Oliver and enjoyed the comfortable silence. It was nice to take a load off and do nothing but veg out. Next to her, Jet nibbled on a square piece of cheese. Sharp cheddar was his preference, but he'd eat any cheese. Well, he wasn't too crazy about blue cheese. Maybe it's too salty for his taste buds. Oliver dug into a breakfast of pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs, pouring syrup over everything. "Wow." She tried to stifle a laugh. "Seems you're having a little bit of pancakes, eggs, and bacon with your syrup there, Oliver." She wondered, has he always had a sweet tooth like this? What gives? Ya trying to give yourself diabetes? Or what? Nah. He shook his head. "I'm just in the mood for something sweet." There were only a few people in the dining hall, and unfortunately Lexi was one of them. Bitch-faced Lexi was in a knot of her equally bitchy friends, and they had all donned obnoxiously neon-bright workout clothes. On the table in front of them, they each had a smoothie, puke pea green or baby poo yellow. She was convinced that anyone who woke up early to work out on a Sunday was certifiably insane, so she ignored them as best she could and continued to make progress on her full stack, drowning in maple syrup. "I need another one, how about you?" He held an empty water bottle up. "Sure, why not?" She took a bite of bacon. Hydration's important after a sex fest. Oliver chuckled, then left the table to get a couple more bottles of water. A flash of neon pink invaded her happy bubble, and Lexi sat down across from her. Deliverance looked up and waited for some sort of interaction to happen, but Lexi just sat there with her arms crossed, looking smug. Deliverance took a drink from her own water to wash down the last bite of food, and then leaned back in her chair. She crossed her arms to mirror Lexi and raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" Lexi bared her teeth in a smile. "I'm so glad you asked. You can start by backing off, and then I'll get back to you. Sound good?" "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Lexi said, her pleasant tone ringing incredibly false. "I think you've had enough of Oliver's attention, and since he'll grow bored of you anyway, you may as well save yourself the trouble and back off now instead of dragging things out." Deliverance barked a laugh and shook her head. "Wow, you really are insane. Is it an ex-girlfriend thing? Or is that just like how you are anyway?" She copied Lexi's ditzy way of speaking and smirked when she saw the other girl frown. "Listen here, you little bitch," Lexi snarled under her breath. "Oliver isn't my ex anything, he just wanted to fuck you since you're the new girl. He likes to chase the new ones. It's like a game for him." Deliverance didn't react, and let the silence stretch out uncomfortably long before asking, "Are you done?" Lexi huffed, sitting up straighter and adopting an aloof tone. "Don't say I didn't warn you. He's a player, but more importantly, he's mine. So back off now or what? You'll give me another speech?" Deliverance rolled her eyes. "Look, Lexi, I may be the new kid, but it's easy to see that Oliver is through with you. It's not my fault that you're a jealous psycho, and it's not my job to hold your hand while you try to get over him. So how about you go fuck yourself, and I can get back to my breakfast. Sound good?" Lexi's face reddened, making Deliverance wonder if anyone had ever combusted on school grounds before, natural causes or otherwise. Deliverance kept her face bored and neutral, mimicking an elder role model. "Headmaster Helms," she thought. "Oh, petty boy, if only you knew how impactful your presence was, you'd be proud." Lexi broke eye contact first, standing from the table. "You'll see," Lexi said simply, and then she sauntered back toward her gaggle of minions. Deliverance shook her head, watching her go. That went well. Better than expected, anyway. Chapter 28. Oliver came back to the table with 2 water bottles in hand. A smile stretched across his face and danced on his kissable lips. But when he followed Deliverance's line of sight, all while she watched a retreating Lexi, his lips turned down into an annoyed frown and the light in his eyes dimmed. It made her really miss seeing the glint in his eyes. When the smile reached his irises, little flecks of copper swirled around inside his eyes. Is that magic or something else, she wondered. He reclaimed his chair, plopped on top of the scent, and then looked at Deliverance with concern. What did Lexi want? Deliverance shrugged, not really sure what she wanted to say to him, or even say about the situation for that matter. It's not as if he doesn't really know why his ex keeps showing up. The thought kind of made her feel a bit depressed. Oh, she wants me to back off. She tried a mildly threatening monologue, but it's too bad for her that I don't scare easily. Oliver's eyebrows knitted together when he frowned. Deliverance, you know I'm through with her, right? You believe me? I believe you, Oliver. She reached out to squeeze his hand reassuringly. Lexi just has some serious issues, I guess. But upon careful consideration, I really don't care. She can be as crazy as she wants, and if she tries to start something with me, then Jet will become my attack flying squirrel and scratch up her annoyingly perfect face for me. Jet poked his head out from where he had been napping in mouse form in her jacket pocket, and zapped into a flying squirrel in a pop of sparks. He squeaked, but any ferocity it might have held was lost to a massive yawn that made Deliverance and Oliver crack up. Oliver stood and offered a hand. "I think Jet has the right idea. I could go for a nap right about now." Deliverance let him pull her to her feet, and then they took their trays to the bus table and made their way outside into the early morning light. Oliver walked her all the way back to her dorm, and then kissed her softly on the cheek. "I think I'm going to crash in my room." Oliver gave Jet one last scratch behind his ears. "Tasha is pissed that I spent the night in your room, and she's going to either mope or set my stuff on fire if I don't give her some attention." "Yikes, good luck with that." "She's harmless, she's just, well, a fireball of protection. Maybe later today, you can come by my room and meet her." Deliverance grinned. "I'd like that. I've never seen a fire drake before." "Make sure you don't tell her that," Oliver joked. "Her ego is already crowding the room, soon there'll be no more room for me." She opened her door and crossed the threshold, turning back to face Oliver. "After I meet Tasha, I was going to go to the library. I have some research to do." "Research? For what?" Deliverance hesitated, but she took a deep breath and decided to trust Oliver. Just because Headmaster Helms had been a dick about her crashed spell, doesn't mean she had to be entirely alone. Besides, she knew she needed all the help she could get. "It's an independent study sort of situation. I'll explain when we're in the library, and then you can decide if you want to help or not." "Cool." "Cool," Oliver echoed, turning to go. "I'll text you when I'm awake and have placated Tasha. Then you can meet a real fire drake, and we can work on your mystery project together." He grinned. "Not bad for a Sunday." Deliverance laughed and waved as he left, then shut the door behind her. She pulled a very sleepy Jet from her pocket and deposited him on her pillow, where he immediately curled up and fell back asleep. She laid down too, her breakfast making her drowsy. Curling up under her comforter, she breathed a sigh. Oliver's scent lingered on her pillow, and she smiled with her eyes closed. Maybe it's not so bad here after all. Chapter 29. Deliverance got to the library before Oliver. Unable to sleep for more than an hour, she felt both tired and energized. An odd combination, but one she had kind of grown accustomed to since arriving at the school. Of course, this morning Jet, who had become rather demanding and a drama queen in his own right, had protested. He had even squeaked indignantly when she started gathering her books. Once he understood sleep time was over, he scurried from her shoulder and made a mad dash to her jacket pocket. It had made her wonder if he would curl up and fall back asleep, which he had done. He'd even managed to catch a few Z's during the trip. A small table deep within the stacks caught her attention. It looked like the perfect centralized spot to occupy. So she set her items down, then went to find a Bible to start examining. It was a task she never in a million years thought she'd do on her own, at least, not without a nun standing over her with a rule and waiting to smack the crap out of her knuckles. God. I can't believe I'm actually going to read a Bible, and on purpose. The words left her lips in a soft whisper. But hey, desperate times called for desperate measures. To her surprise, she found a shelf full of various versions and reached out to grab one. She half expected her hand to burst into flames, given how the sisters at the temple had treated her. But her fingers brushed the smooth spine of the book without incident, and she carried it back to the table. Flipping to the very end, she at least knew that Revelation was the very last book. She found the first page of the section and used a scrap of notebook paper to mark her place. She then began to read. Revelation chapter 1 verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him, to show unto his servants. Deliverance massaged her temples. Show? Were they serious? She decided to skim and see if there was anything a bit more relevant to the actual apocalypse. Slowly she slogged through the first 4 chapters, but she perked up when she reached chapter 5. Revelation chapter 5 verse 1, and I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne, a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. 7 seals, she murmured to herself, then kept reading. Revelation chapter 5 verse 2, and I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loosen the seals thereof?" Revelation chapter 5 verse 3, and no man in heaven nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. Deliverance frowned, thinking, if no one's able to open the book and fuck with the seals, that's a good thing, right? She took out her phone, pulling up the notes she had quickly jotted down after the encounter with Coy and the horseman. Coy Sepala, SP? Klein. Rafa. Ian. Ted. Apocalypse, Revelation? Bible? Seals? Pascal? My mom? Reviewing the list jogged her memory a bit, and yes, she was sure that Coy had implied that the seals could and would be opened. I'm missing something. I'm sure of it, she said with a sigh. But what? Why can't things ever be easy? But she knew the answer, and what she sought wasn't going to magically fall in her lap. Fuck, that means more reading. Deliverance took the time to copy her phone's notes into her notebook, so she could keep everything in the same place. Then she went back to skimming the thin pages of the Bible. Revelation chapter 6 verse 1, and I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." Come and see what? She rubbed her eyes, then refocused. Revelation chapter 6 verse 2, and I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. A chill slithered down her spine. Whoever this Lamb is, she thought to herself, he already gives me the creeps. Chapter 30. What the hell? Deliverance was tempted to pinch herself to see if she'd wake from a dream, but she knew this wasn't a dream. In fact, she knew she was in deep shit. After all, she didn't think it was a coincidence that there were four beasts, and she had met four horsemen. Her eyes caught on the last three words. Come and see. She didn't want to come and see. Hell, she didn't want any of this. What the holy fuck did I get myself into? The words bounded around in her head like a game of bong. Her breaths came in staggered puffs, making her feel air-hungry. Dark spots floated in front of her eyes. Am I hyperventilating? Deliverance cradled her head in her hands and exhaled sharply. Must. Slow. Down. Breathing. She chanted the same four words over and over again. Jet poked his head out of her pocket and zapped into his flying squirrel form so he could latch onto her wrist. She thought it was the closest thing to a hug that her familiar's tiny body could manage. The gesture made her smile, despite the weight sitting heavily on her chest. She sat up and closed her eyes, so that she could focus her mind on the task at hand. Okay, think this through, she said to herself more than Jet. This is just research to prepare for a recon mission, and I gotta start somewhere, right? Jet nodded, then uttered a few squeaks as if to vocalize his agreement. I've got to figure all of this out, we both do. She patted his little head. It's just gonna take a bit of time. Breathing easier now, she continued in chapter 6 of Revelation. Revelation chapter 6 verse 3, and when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. What the fuck? She shook her head. Can the words be any vaguer? Revelation chapter 6 verse 4, and there went out another horse that was red. Power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Her attention caught on the mention of the color red, and she remembered how the horsemen had appeared in columns of colored smoke. In the first two mentions of the seals and the accompanying horsemen, there were white and red horses. There had been columns of white and red smoke with Klein and Rafa respectively. Klein had been creepy more than anything else, but Rafa had triggered a visceral response in her. The unrelenting panic she had felt when the horseman had stepped toward her resurfaced. He had left her to cower against the wall like a frightened rabbit. An experience that was both humiliating and worrisome, because it emphasized just how unprepared she was for all of this apocalypse fuckery. She shook her head to clear the memory, and turned back to the Bible. 2 seals down, 5 more to go. Revelation chapter 6 verse 5 And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. Revelation chapter 6 verse 7 And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. Of course that's what the fuck he said. Another sigh left her lips. Revelation chapter 6 verse 8 And I looked, and behold, a pale ore, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Oh man. Deliverance sagged against the back of her chair. We're fucked yet. 4 seals, 4 horsemen, and there's still 3 more after that? 3 more seals after hell followed with him. Jet was still being a comfort bracelet, so she softly scratched between his ears. He squeaked and renewed his grip. Yeah, I know, she said, sighing. Like, I knew the Bible was dramatic and all, but hey, talk about overkill. Chapter 31. Deliverance's phone chimed, drawing her back into the reality of the library and the current state of affairs. Her life had always been hard, but this crap took the proverbial cake. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Her life depended on it, literally depended on it. I'm a half-blood witch on death row. And if I don't figure this shit out, I'll be responsible for the apocalypse. She groaned, then let out a heavy sigh. Yeah, bringer of destruction won't look good on a job resume. A bout of nervous giggles hit, making her insides feel fluttery. Great. Not only am I doomed, but I'm a stark raving mad lunatic. She glanced at her phone. It was Oliver, and she welcomed the opportunity to fill him in on the situation. Maybe with his gift of language understanding, he could make heads or tails of all the riddles. Opening the screen, she read his texts. I'm awake. Ready to meet Tasha? Deliverance groaned. She had forgotten their agreement to meet in Oliver's room once he woke. She didn't want to abandon her train of thought or relinquish her table, so she texted him back. Already at the library. Meet here now. I'll see Tasha after. 3 wavy lines popped up on the screen. His response was quick. Okay. Heading there now. Deliverance smiled. One pro of Oliver always being on his phone was that he responded right away. She let him know roughly where her table was in the library, and then returned to where she had left off. Revelation chapter 6 verse 9 And when he had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God, and for the testimony which they held. She read the wording again, hoping to catch some subtext, but the content left her just as confused the second time around as the first. Revelation chapter 6 verse 10 And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? Shoulders back, her body went stiff, and she cradled Jet closer. Revelation chapter 6 verse 11 And white robes were given unto every one of them. And it was said unto them, that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants as well as their brethren be killed as they were, and the task should be fulfilled. She cringed a bit at the last verse for the 5th seal. A bunch of people in white robes? To be killed as they were, so that some crazy prophecy could be fulfilled? The sisters who had raised her read this stuff, and didn't run screaming from the temple. It made her wonder what they thought of the message. 2 seals left, she thought to herself. Let's see where the crazy train stops. Revelation chapter 6 verse 12 And I beheld when he had opened the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Oh, of course, she said quietly. An earthquake, an eclipse, and a red moon. Fucking figures. She skimmed through the next few verses, numb at this point to all the doom and gloom, until she finally reached the 7th seal mentioned in chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8 verse 1 And when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. Revelation chapter 8 verse 2 And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Deliverance closed the Bible, and added the final seal to her messy page of notes. Half an hour of silence, and then 7 angels and 7 trumpets, as if 4 horsemen and their goddamn horses weren't enough. There was only so much Bible speak she could stand in one sitting. And right now her brain was bursting at the seams with verses and angels and trumpets. Memories of the horsemen's first visit filled her body with dread, because she had a feeling she'd see them again sometime soon. There's so much information, Jet. She decided to digest it one verse at a time. The angels and trumpets will have to wait until another day. Chapter 32. A soft knocking sound, distant at first, grew closer and startled Deliverance. She shot up in her seat, dazed and a tad bit disoriented. Jet squeaked at the sudden movement, making his displeasure known. She looked up from her notes and saw Oliver looking down at her, one eyebrow raised. "You were pretty deep in thought there, didn't want you getting lost in your notebook." He grinned and then bent down to give her a quick peck on the cheek. She turned her head at the last second, so he caught her on the mouth instead, and she laughed at the startled look on his face. They both smiled at each other, and then Oliver sank into the chair across from her. "So," he said, eyeing her notes, "what's this secret project of yours? And wait, is that a Bible?" Deliverance rolled her eyes at him. "Yes, it's a Bible. And no, I haven't been smited yet, so I think we're safe." Oliver raised an eyebrow again. "Is smiting a legitimate concern?" "I spent a lot of time in a temple, and the good sisters thought for sure that I'd burst into flames whenever I tread upon holy ground." She chuckled to herself. "Sorry, old joke." He waved her off, then reached out to tap on her notebook. "So, what's the Bible got to do with your secret project? Is it for research?" Deliverance sighed. "You could say that. Remember the familiar spell I did last week? The one where we thought it didn't work, but it turned out Jet had just been hiding." "Yeah. Well, here's what actually happened." She gave Oliver a quick rundown of her encounter with Coy and his horsemen, then her cursory research on the 7 seals so far. When she looked back up, he looked unconvinced. "So, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse appeared to you, and only to you, claiming to be breaking the 7 seals and therefore ending the world as we know it." Deliverance nodded reluctantly. "I know I sound batshit insane, but that's what happened." "And is there more?" "I went to Headmaster Helms." "How'd that go?" "He didn't believe me, hence the independent study." Oliver nodded slowly, still processing. "Okay, so the horsemen are trying to break the 7 seals. What exactly can we do about it?" Deliverance breathed a sigh of relief at his use of the word "we." She was glad to not be carrying this all by herself anymore, even if Oliver very obviously didn't quite believe her. Not yet, anyway. She spun her notebook around to show him the first page, which was covered in nearly illegible scribbling about the first seal. So the first mention of the seals is in Chapter 6, and it says that this lamb guy opens the seal and one of 4 beasts says, "Come and see," before riding in on a white horse. He has a bow and a crown, and it sounds like he just generally starts fucking shit up. She paged through her notes. This is what it said: "He went forth conquering and to conquer." And then Revelation goes on to describe the other equally terrifying seals, which is why I think we need to just focus on the one for now. Oliver nodded. "Okay, works for me. What else does it say about the first seal?" "That's it." "What do you mean, that's it?" Deliverance pointed at the Bible, as if it was the book's fault. "There are exactly 2 sentences describing the first seal. Chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, if you want to read them." Oliver slid the Bible in front of himself, and quickly found the passage Deliverance had referenced. He obviously was much more practiced at navigating gigantic books, probably because they weren't as confusing for him as they were for her. "Pros of being an allegist," she mused. Oliver's eyes scanned the page a few times, then he sat back in his chair. "It says that he has a bow." His voice became serious. It was as if he transitioned into his full academic mode. "But is given a crown. I think that's an important distinction." "Okay, so Brainiac, what does that mean?" "Hang on, I'm thinking." Chapter 33. She and Oliver sat in silence for a few minutes, Deliverance taking the opportunity to give Jet some much-needed attention. His little paws clung to her jacket, and the more she scratched his head and rubbed his belly, the way he nuzzled her neck reminded her of a cat. "We must be missing something," Oliver finally said. "There are so many things that could come from 2 sentences. Is there anything else we can use to narrow it down?" Deliverance shrugged, not bothering to scan her notes. She was just as stuck as Oliver was. "I've shown you all my notes, and you read the verses yourself. It's too broad. I have no idea why they'd come to me of all people with this, considering how awful I am with puzzles and wordplay, not to mention all the religion shit. It doesn't make any sense." Oliver paused, tapping the Bible with one of Deliverance's pens, but otherwise sitting perfectly still. "You have to be the focal point." His voice was hushed, almost as if he hadn't meant to speak at all. Deliverance looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "Well, the horsemen appeared to you specifically, no one else. You must be some kind of key for them. If you don't mind me asking, what kind of witch are you? Like your specific designation?" She looked at him blankly, and his face reddened. "Sorry, I know it's kind of invasive, but I think it's important. Are you by chance a blood witch?" Deliverance blanched but nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm a blood witch." She didn't want to be too accusatory, but his words had left her shaken. "How the fuck did you guess that?" Oliver seemed too wrapped up in his thoughts to register her tone. "In town, there's an old fountain behind the strip mall. It hasn't been maintained, so a lot of people don't even know it exists. And why the fuck do I care? I'm getting there. Just be patient. Professor Hawthorne brought me there to show me some of the inscriptions in the base of the fountain, because they're in Latin." "Okay, and what does Latin on a decrepit old fountain have to do with my being a blood witch?" One of the words neither of us could figure out was magasong. He wrote it down in her notebook so that she could see the spelling. Deliverance was annoyed by how perfect his handwriting was, compared to her chicken scratch. She ignored it and tried to follow along. The other words on the fountain all had to do with water and mentions of the divine, but this one word stuck out because it isn't proper Latin. "What do you mean it isn't proper?" "Well, it's 2 words mashed together into a sort of slang, which is what people did when they didn't have the exact word or words they needed." Deliverance snapped her fingers to get his attention. "Oliver, you're losing me. Get to the point. Please." He nodded quickly. "Right. Okay. Magasong isn't a word, but magus and sang are separate words. Together they can be roughly translated to blood witch," she whispered. Oliver spread his hands wide to encompass all of the table, across the Bible and her notes, and the weight of the information they were piecing together. "The kicker," he said, "is that the centerpiece of the fountain is a limestone horse. A white horse. That's where the first seal is." Deliverance locked eyes with Oliver. "It has to be. It fits with a lot of the verses, but even if it is," Oliver countered, "how are we going to get there? And more importantly, what are we supposed to do when and if we get there?" The gears in Deliverance's mind were already spinning. Students went into town every Saturday, which would be her ticket to getting close to the fountain and theoretically the first seal, but there was the issue of her chaperone. Maybe Jet could provide a distraction? What if? "You're cute when you're scheming," Oliver joked, reaching out to take hold of her hand. Deliverance let their fingers twine together, and she looked into Oliver's copper eyes. "I think I have a plan." Chapter 34. "Hey, you hungry?" Oliver ran a hand across her back, then messaged her neck. "Yeah." Deliverance was running on fumes and needed to recharge. "Let's break for lunch. We can do more planning after. After we eat, you can finally meet Tasha." "Cool." She adjusted Jet, placing him on her shoulder. "How about you? Do you want to meet the fire drake, too?" Her excitement, while great, was tempered by worry. What if she doesn't like me? What's not to love? He winked at her, then flashed her a reassuring smile. Oliver got along with Jet famously, but what if Tasha wasn't as open to deliverance? As she had quickly learned, supers and their familiars had unshakable bonds, so if Tasha decided deliverance didn't have a place in Oliver's life, then she wouldn't. It was as simple as that. They ate a couple of slices of pizza from the cafeteria, then made their way to Oliver's room. He unlocked the door and held it open so that deliverance could cross the threshold first. "After you." She stepped inside warily. It looked very similar to her own room, which she had expected, but unlike her room, it actually looked lived in. More of a home than the four-walls approach with which deliverance treated her own quarters. The bed had a flannel comforter, there were posters on the walls. Ignoring the layers of jackets heaped on the back of his desk chair, Oliver's room appeared neat and comfortable. Oliver stepped around her and took her hand, pulling her toward the bed. "Don't be nervous." "That's easy for you to say." "No, really, don't be nervous or she'll pick up on it." "Oh great, now you tell me." A chuckle passed his lips, and she wasn't sure if he was serious or joking. They sat side by side on his bed. After a few seconds, Oliver patted his lap gently. "Tasha? Come meet deliverance." There was movement from underneath the jackets, and a reptilian head poked out from between the layers of fabric. Deliverance held her breath, unsure of what the protocol was for meeting another super's familiar. The fire drake slowly removed herself from the jacket nest, crossed the room, then inched toward them. She gracefully leapt into Oliver's lap, then craned her neck to sniff at deliverance. "Don't worry. She's just getting to know you." "Yeah, I can see that." Deliverance sat perfectly still, unsure of what to do. Oliver took her hand and set it on Tasha's back, then he scratched under Tasha's chin. The fire drake still looked wary of deliverance, but a low hum started deep in her throat, and she leaned into Oliver's touch. Hesitantly, deliverance began stroking Tasha's scaly back, and she let herself relax slightly. She remembered Oliver describing his familiar as a puppy-sized dragon, and she used that image to calm herself down. Jet took the opportunity to poke his mouse nose out of her jacket pocket, his whiskers twitching nervously. Tasha's gaze zeroed in on the movement, and she tilted her head to get a better look at him. "Look, buddy," said Deliverance, "she's your first play friend." Jet seemed to be just as nervous as Deliverance, because he disappeared back into her pocket. "Give them time to get to know each other." Oliver gave her hand a squeeze. Tasha craned her neck, moving from Oliver's lap and half onto Deliverance's, snuffling at her pocket curiously. There was a muffled pop of sparks from her jacket, which sent Tasha back on Oliver's lap and into his arms. Jet burst from Deliverance's pocket in finch form, quickly moving to perch on the top of the bathroom door. Tasha hissed and scrambled off Oliver's lap, tunneling back into her cave of jackets. Deliverance put a hand over her mouth and tried to stifle her laughter. She watched the fire drake's glowing yellow eyes blinking up at the tiny little finch. "Tasha, that's Jet," Oliver sighed, finally breaking the stifling silence. "Deliverance is familiar. He's a changeling, but he's always very small. You're safe. He won't hurt you." A low growl rumbled deep in her throat. The pitch came across as distressed. Oliver squeezed Deliverance's hand once more, rose and then moved across the room to crouch by his familiar. "Jet? Can you come here, please?" Deliverance spoke quietly to Jet, loud enough so that everyone in the room could hear her, but not so loud that she would startle Tasha. "She isn't going to hurt you either." Tasha lifted her head to follow Jet's flight back to Deliverance, where he zapped back into his favorite mouse form. Tasha allowed herself to be coaxed out of her hiding spot, and Oliver cradled her in his arms to comfort her. It was adorable how plainly he cared for his familiar, and Deliverance smiled. Oliver knelt by the bed, setting Tasha on the flannel comforter gently, then stroked her back as Deliverance had done. Jet approached Tasha slowly on his tiny mouse paws, and ever so gently touched their noses together. A hum started in Tasha's throat, and Deliverance thought it might be the fire drake's version of purring. Jet seemed to come to a similar conclusion, because he delicately jumped into her nose and started exploring her scales. Tasha followed his movements as best she could, craning her neck and studying him curiously, and when Jet reached her tail, she curled it back around herself, so that Jet was in front of her once again. Jet squeaked at her and Tasha snorted once. I think she likes him now. Oliver looked up at Deliverance and shrugged. Yeah, now that she's not so scared of him. Deliverance returned her attention to their familiars. Maybe her being wary of Tasha wasn't a one-way street. Without prompting from Oliver, Deliverance reached a hand out very slowly and scratched under the fire drake's chin the way she had seen Oliver do it earlier. Tasha met Deliverance's stare with slitted eyes, but they relaxed, and she leaned into Deliverance's touch. There was a collective sigh of relief from everyone in the room, and then Oliver stood. Ha, he said quietly, grinning at Deliverance, that went well. Wait, she thought, did he expect something else? Chapter 35. The rest of the week passed quickly, Deliverance and Oliver settling into a routine of classes and research in the library. And sex. Lots of sex. There weren't any more sleepovers during the week, to keep Tasha from singeing any more of Oliver's stuff in retaliation for her abandonment, but they found time throughout the days and nights to continue exploring each other's bodies. On Friday, Deliverance brought Oliver to her room after their last classes to go over the plan for the following day. They both sat on the bed, Oliver against the wall and Deliverance against his chest, and Oliver hooked his chin over her shoulder to follow Deliverance's gestures. So the buses will pick us up and bring us into town, dropping us off in the main square just like last weekend. Yes? Oliver nodded. And this week, we won't have Professor Renove studying Jet, which should make things a lot easier. Deliverance flinched, remembering that she still hadn't told Oliver about her status as a Class 5 blood witch. There really wasn't any getting around it now, so she would just have to tell him. There was no other way to explain the presence of an armed chaperone. Oliver. Deliverance started, not sure how to begin. He tilted his head from where it was resting on her shoulder to peck her on the cheek, waiting expectantly for her to continue. When she didn't, he leaned back and scooted over so that he could meet her eyes. What's wrong? He asked, genuine concern making his copper eyes gleam. Are you worried about the plan? The fountain won't be hard to find. I've been there a few times and can lead us straight there. He smiled encouragingly, and Deliverance let her eyes drop to where her hands were twisting in her lap. It was now or never. It'll be a bit more complicated than that. We have to get away from the group to visit the fountain, but we have to get away from another chaperone. Specifically, my chaperone, who very likely will be both trained for magical combat and armed. Oliver was silent, and so she quickly looked up to gauge his reaction, ready to duck her head again if necessary. His head was cocked to the side, but he looked concerned. Deliverance, he said, speaking carefully, what's the chaperone for? Are you okay? She realized that she would have to spell it out for him, and that there would be no convenient leaps in logic to spare her from her explanation. The chaperone is for me because I'm a Class 5 magic user. I can't be outside of the wards unsupervised. Wait, you're a blood witch and a Class 5 super? He leaned back, just barely an inch, but to Deliverance it felt like a slap in the face. There was a heavy silence settling over the room between them in the distance Oliver had created. Deliverance hadn't known how much a single inch of space could echo. Slowly, gradually, Oliver let their bodies press back together, and Deliverance carefully leaned her back against his chest, not wanting to scare him away. He tentatively hooked his chin back over her shoulder, wrapped his arms around her midsection and breathed a sigh into her hair. A Class 5 blood witch, huh? He asked quietly, huffing out a breath. I'll try not to be too intimidated, as long as you try not to kick my ass just because you can. Deliverance grinned. I promise I won't. Unless you deserve it. Oliver laughed, squeezing her tight and whispering in her ear, well, in that case, I'll try to be on my best behavior. He kissed her 3 times fast on her cheek, making Deliverance squirm in the vice grip of his arms, and when their laughter subsided, Oliver sighed. Okay, so the chaperone will be a problem if we're going to get to the fountain by ourselves. Do we have any idea how to get around them? Deliverance whistled softly, and Jet zapped into Finch form on her desk in his customary pop of sparks. He flitted over to where she and Oliver were sitting on the bed. Deliverance ducked, leaving Oliver to withstand the chaos of fluttering wings in his face as he tried to bat Jet away with his hands. In just a few moments, Jet relented and flew across the room to where Deliverance was leaning against the wall with a smirk on her face. Oliver blinked at her, looking down to where Deliverance had just been pressed against him, to where she now was leaning casually against the wall. She grinned, and Jet zapped into his mouse form so that he could squeak at Oliver from across the room. Simple but effective. Oliver shook his head. I'll give you that. So, Jet is the distraction for us getting to the fountain, and then what? A sigh passed his lips. What are we looking for? That's the hard part, Deliverance admitted, walking back to her bed. It could be an inscription or a symbol. Hopefully, we'll know it when we see it. And if not, then what? I plan on taking a ton of pictures, so we can review them later. Remember, this is reconnaissance only. Okay, so we're going to ditch the chaperone to have a look around the fountain, and then we're going to regroup next week with the help of the pictures and whatever else we can manage to find. Exactly. Maybe we can even raid one of the practicum chambers for some extra protection just in case things go sideways. When she was close enough, Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form and launched himself at Oliver, who quickly caught him. Jet wound around Oliver's fingers before coming to rest in the palm of his hand, whiskers twitching contentedly. Oliver looked up at Deliverance and smiled. Sounds like as good a plan as any. There might even be time to get some food and enjoy the trip, if we get the recon done early. After all, it is our 1 day out of the wards per week. Deliverance groaned, dropping heavily to her bed next to Oliver. Don't remind me. The wards make me feel so claustrophobic. I can ignore them for a little while, but every time I remember, it's like getting the wind knocked out of me. Oliver bumped their shoulders together gently, frowning in concern. Is it really that bad for you? She nodded miserably, but then shook her head and took a deep breath. Anyway, enough about the wards and our plan for tomorrow. All of those are future Oliver and future Deliverance problems. And future Jet problems, but she looked at Jet, who was already dozing in Oliver's cupped hand. He seems unconcerned. Oliver stood, then he gently deposited Jet on Deliverance's desk inside a small cradle they had made from washcloths, so that he could have somewhere comfy to sleep other than Deliverance's pillow. He turned back around and knelt in front of where Deliverance sat on the bed. She automatically reached up to run her fingers through his hair, and he leaned into her touch. He grinned and tilted his head. I can think of a few ways to start the weekend off right. Deliverance grinned back, tugging at the collar of his shirt, so that their mouths were inches apart. Oh yeah. He nodded, and they both laughed, crashing together in what was quickly becoming a comfortable norm. Chapter 36. On Saturday, Deliverance was examining herself in her bathroom mirror, relieved to finally be back in her normal clothes. It was strange. She spent the majority of her time at the academy in uniform, but she had never and probably would never consider it normal attire. A knock on her door made her jump, and she quickly shrugged into her jacket before swinging the door open with a grin. Her face fell when she saw not Oliver, but a brute of a man who bore more resemblance to a refrigerator than a human. He had close-cropped black hair and a tight t-shirt that was about a size and a half too small, probably on purpose so that he could show off his ripped physique. Deliverance was not impressed. She leaned against her doorframe with her arms crossed to show it. You must be the chaperone. He grimaced at her, and she wondered if it was supposed to be a smile. And you're Deliverance Mackey? She sighed. The one and only. And you are? My name is Roman, he said gruffly, standing so straight that it was making Deliverance's back hurt to look at him. I will be your chaperone for the academy's outing today. I gathered. Do you need more time to prepare yourself, or are you ready to depart now? Deliverance rolled her eyes at him. We're going into a tiny town on a weekly school field trip, not arming up for battle. At ease, soldier, for fuck's sake. He looked perplexed, and Deliverance groaned. Okay, whatever. Let me grab my bag, and then I'll be prepared to depart momentarily. He nodded as if she had spoken with gravity, and she spun on her heel to retrieve her bag and jet. Her familiar zapped into his finch form and perched on her shoulder, tilting his head to study Roman, who was currently taking up almost the entire doorway with his large stature. She spoke under her breath, just loud enough that Jet could hear. He's huge, but his size will only get in his own way. You can still work your magic. Jet chirped at her, then zapped into mouse form so that he could scurry into her jacket pocket. Deliverance turned back around and shouldered her bag, and found Roman staring at her pocket, looking even more confused. That's Jet. She shrugged dismissively. He's a changeling. Can we go now? Roman stepped aside so that she could pass, and followed her down the hall, staying exactly 2 steps behind her at all times. Deliverance quickly pulled out her phone and texted Oliver. Meet you at bus. Got my shadow for the day. His response was quick, and within seconds her phone buzzed. Good news? Or bad? Deliverance slowed down, then cast a glance over her shoulder only to find him matching her pace. Hard to tell. You'll see. Pocketing her phone and continuing to walk toward the building's exit, she was hyper-aware of Roman looming behind her. Her fingers twitched restlessly. She took a few deep calming breaths to keep her volatile magic to herself. I may be a class 5 blood witch, the thought entered her mind, but I'm still very much a fledgling. She didn't feel like it would be a good first test of her fighting skills to go up against an opponent who carried himself like a military tank. Stepping into the sunshine of the morning, Deliverance caught sight of Oliver and grinned. For a few perfect moments, she ignored the recon mission and the apocalypse and Roman, and she just reveled in the knowledge that she would have a few hours outside of the wards with her very attractive and technically almost boyfriend. Deliverance allowed herself a few moments of weightlessness, and then relented and let the weight of her responsibilities come crashing back down. She mentally staggered under the weight, but she righted herself and gave Oliver a hug and quick kiss. This is Roman. She motioned grandly towards her chaperone. Oliver whistled. Damn, what do they feed you guys? What are you 6'4"? 5. Roman unsurprisingly didn't answer, and so Deliverance shook her head. She tapped her finger against her chin, pretending to be lost in considerable thought. His personality is a bit lacking thus far, but maybe he'll warm up a bit on the ride into town. A serious expression masked her features. What do you think, Roman? Good chance, slight chance, or no chance of reciprocated banter? A slight chance then. She was met with stony silence, so she shrugged, linking arms with Oliver. I can work with that. They boarded the bus, and soon enough were passing through the wards, and Deliverance breathed a sigh of relief. Stoneface to her left still posed a real problem, and the promise of a challenging day of recon work waited for her. Well, at least I'll be free to face what may come. Chapter 37. When the bus arrived in the center of town, Deliverance and Oliver were in no rush to get to the fountain. As they had decided in their earlier planning, they would explore the town for a bit, get some food to eat, and then test just how flexible the leash on Deliverance was. With any luck, there'd be a kink in there somewhere that allowed her some breathing room. But she doubted that'd be the case. Nothing's ever that easy, she thought to herself. As the saying goes, if it seems too good to be true, it's not real. Geez, is this what my life has come to? Deliverance couldn't help but wonder. A series of chaperoned events before my demise? Maybe there was more than met the eye, so to speak. She tried to look at things through different lenses, but it always came back to one thing. As a half-blood witch, her life, whether she lived or died, all centered around her ability to control a magic she knew little about. A piece of cake. She sighed. God, I'm screwed. Trying to take her mind off things, Deliverance set out to do some shopping. She had enough clothes from the previous weekend, but after seeing how comfortable Oliver's room had looked, she wanted to find some personal touches for her own living quarters. A few select pieces that screamed, "This is my room, bitches, so fuck off." Plus, she really needed to find a more permanent solution for her familiar. Number 1 shopping priority. She raised a single finger in the air. To find a pillow that Jet likes. That way, he could stop sleeping on a pile of washcloths or Deliverance's pillow. Roman kept an emotionless mask plastered over his face during the shopping expedition, but she was sure he wasn't too happy with the current activities, which was fine with her. How about here? Oliver stopped in front of a small home goods store with decorative pillows. Looks like the perfect place to start, Operation Pillow, for something nice and comfy for you, little buddy. Once inside the building, Deliverance took her sweet time letting Jet explore his new bedding options. And there were so many options. Square pillows. Circular pillows with dainty lace. Pillows in the shape of every letter of the alphabet. And she even saw pillows with faces of famous dead people, including a few presidents. Jet in mouse form slid off a pillow, and in a pop of sparks he turned into a finch before hitting the floor. "I don't think he likes silk." Oliver laughed. "I think it's too slippery for his mouse fur and tiny paws." Well, Deliverance rolled her eyes, watching Jet struggle to get free of his next bed sampling. "He doesn't like the heavily embroidered pillows over here either." "Why's that?" Oliver searched through a square container filled with pillows. "Because his little talons got stuck on the stitching." After some thorough searching, testing out possible bed selection, and a few disappearing acts to see how Roman would react, she and Oliver finally found a soft, white suede pillow that Jet immediately melted into. The contrast of his black fur against the white pillow made him look a bit like an ink stain, but as long as Jet was happy, so was she. Deliverance bought the pillow with her school card, then stowed it in her bag. It took some convincing to keep Jet out of her bag instead of curled up with his new bed, but Deliverance gently reminded him that they still had a job to do. Reluctantly, he zapped into his finch form, and took turns riding on hers and Oliver's shoulders. "I'm hungry." Deliverance tapped Oliver's chest. "How about you?" "Yeah, I could go for an early lunch to beat the rush of students." "How about you?" Deliverance shot a glance his way. "Are you allowed to eat on the job?" "I'll grab some sandwiches from the cafe across the street." Oliver stepped off the sidewalk. "Claim a shady bench in the main square for us." "Will do." She nodded. Deliverance took off, heading to the square, found a seat under a tree, and then plopped down. "So where'd you come from?" She tried to strike up a conversation. "From around." Roman checked his watch. "I haven't seen you at the school before." "No. You haven't. Are you always this talkative?" "No." He did a visual sweep of the area, keeping her in view at all times. Chapter 38. Oliver came jogging up, a bag in one hand, and a cardboard holder with 4 bottles of water nestled snugly inside. "I got an extra thing of water," said Oliver, a smile sparked on his kissable lips. "I figured Jet might need a drink." "Oh, thanks." She wondered if he was always this attentive to a date and her familiar, or if he was going out of his way to be nice to her since she had arrived. Either way, she didn't mind the extra attention. And from what she could see, it was more than fine with Jet too. Roman, ever dutiful, stood behind them like a lump of coal. Well, more like a concrete statue with the personality to match. Out in the sunshine, and in the sweltering heat without shade, it looked as if the shirt he wore had shrunk a few more size. If he takes a deep breath, will his shirt rip like Beast from X-Men or the Hulk? "Hey Roman." Deliverance waved to him. "We can make some room if you want to sit. We even have an extra sandwich." Oliver raised the wrapped food in the air as an invitation. Roman shook his head to decline, and continued scanning the area. "It's as if you're royalty," laughed Oliver. "Got your own bodyguard and all. Or a prisoner." Deliverance tried not to be too disheartened as she ate her sandwich. Roman was somehow even more strict than she had expected, especially compared with how Renove had cut her some slack. He was being less of a leash and more like glue. She was beginning to have doubts that they would be able to get away to go examine the fountain. After their lunch, Deliverance walked with Oliver in a lap of the main square. They chatted idly, window shopping without going inside any particular stores, but even though they were acting relaxed, Deliverance could feel the tension rising between them. More and more they would check the sky to watch the day slipping away from them, each catching the other's eye as if to say, "What the hell do we do now?" Deliverance took out her phone and sent Oliver a text, even though he was walking right beside her. Roman was practically breathing down her neck, so she didn't have a good way to have a private conversation. "We're running out of time. Any ideas?" Oliver's phone chimed, and he took it out of his pocket to check. He laughed a bit at their unconventional conversation, but quickly tapped out a reply. "Maybe Jet can get loose in a store and cause some mayhem? I can get in the way to delay the shadow. How fast can you run?" Deliverance grinned after reading his message and stowed her phone. She made a show of grabbing at Oliver's arm and pointed at the window of a small electronics shop. "I want to go in there. Come on." She dragged Oliver inside, and the shadow followed 2 steps behind. They did a quick tour of the shelves, and Deliverance's eye caught view of a stereo. She hadn't gotten anything besides Jet's new pillow for her room. Maybe next weekend she could pick it up, assuming they let her out of the wards again after the stunt she was about to pull. She loitered by the doorway, checking out a rotating display case, and then she pulled Jet out of her pocket so he could rest on her shoulder. He quickly zapped into his Finch form, ready to go, and she tapped Oliver's arm as a heads up that she was about to make her move. Before she could change her mind, she whistled sharply and pulled open the door, lunging outside. She sprinted away from the shop, hearing a shout from Roman and a crashing sound before the door swung shut. Ducking into the first alley she came to, she kept up her pace until she was behind the strip of stores and could hide amongst the trees in the bordering woods. She was tempted to look back and check for signs of pursuit, but decided that getting to the fountain would have to be her top priority. Chapter 39. Pulling up the hood of her jacket to hide her bright red hair, Deliverance brought up a mental image of the rough map. The one Oliver had drawn for her, in case they had gotten separated, and he couldn't lead the way. It was easy enough to find the old path, despite the overgrowth, and she followed it through a maze of vegetation until she came to the final bend of the path. If it weren't for the impending doom looming over her, she'd have enjoyed the walk. Being out in nature had often calmed her as a child. Taking long walks through wooded trails was something her mother used to do with her. As a kid, she thought it was the coolest thing ever. It never occurred to her that her mother opted for long walks to keep her out of the public eye. Plus, money was always scarce, and a walk through a public park or wooded trail was free, so it never dug into the monetary food fund. Enough of the nostalgia, she scolded herself. Stay focused. She pushed her way through some thick vines that snaked up into the canopy of the trees, and across the ground like an intricate web of a spider. Once she squeezed through to the other side, there in the middle of a clearing, she saw it, the fountain. It was just as Oliver had described, but it was a whole lot bigger than Deliverance had expected. The giant rearing horse gleamed white in the soft afternoon light that filtered through the tree-massive canopy overhead. She could only imagine the way it must have looked when it was maintained and brimming with water. A lost centerpiece of a town that chose to go modern. In a hurry, she reached the base of the fountain and found the inscriptions Oliver had mentioned. She was still terrible at Latin, but she recognized a few words. Corona for crown, fawns for fountain, and finally Magasong, blood witch. She lightly traced the carved letters with her fingertips. It wasn't that she hadn't believed Oliver, it was just that their research had remained in her mind as just that, research. This fountain was tangible proof there was a latticework of movement much larger than herself, and she felt impossibly small in comparison. Deliverance shook her head to clear it. She was here for a reason, to gather valuable information and intel, so she and Oliver could come up with next steps in a well-thought-out plan. All she had to do was take some pictures, then book it back to town with a few choice excuses for Roman. She already had a history of needing freedom, backed by her file, so helpfully provided by the sisters. If luck was on her side, and only if they believed her, it would seem like a wild whim that she could promise to never do again. Stick to the plan. Don't stray. Slipping her phone out of her pocket, she snapped pictures of everything she thought might be useful. Slowly, she circled the fountain to get all of the inscriptions, most of which were way beyond her comprehension, and she found a few symbols that lined up with the verses in Revelation. There was a bow and arrow, and of course the massive white horse in the center of the fountain. Hooked on one of the horse's ears appeared to be a crown to match the Latin corona. She was zooming in on the horse's head to capture the crown, trying to see if she had missed anything else that could be useful, when someone appeared behind her. "Bonjour, chérie," said an unfamiliar and accented female voice. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Deliverance whirled around to find a willowy woman leaning casually against a tree, partially obscured by shadows. She raised her arms in a placating gesture and stepped into the light. She was maybe in her late 20s, had short cropped hair so blonde that it almost looked white when hit by sunlight. But most striking of all her features were her slanted eyes, currently sparkling with amusement. They were pitch black and dark, so dark that the woman's pupils were indistinguishable from the irises. Exactly like Deliverance's eyes. Chapter 40. Taking a few slow steps back, her heels bumped into the fountain ledge. Her arms shot out, then moved like a pinwheel. Got a bad feeling about this, she thought to herself. A really, really, really bad one. Not only was there a stranger who apparently knew her, which put her at a disadvantage, but their impromptu meeting was happening by this specific fountain of all possible places. A fountain directly related to the actual apocalypse. A coincidence? I think not. She chewed on the words. She tried to find her voice, but discovered her mouth felt as if it was now stuffed full of cotton. She coughed once, twice, 3 times to clear her throat. "And who the hell are you?" The woman smirked and crossed her arms, radiating arrogance. "Why, chérie, I am Pascal. Coy told me he mentioned my name, so I suppose that will give you a little context." Deliverance gulped. She had assumed Pascal was the male version of the name, but she had obviously assumed incorrectly. Which begged the question, what else had she read wrong? "How do you know Coy? And furthermore, why the hell are you trying to break the seals? And does this mean she can see the horsemen too?" She wondered. "Oh, I'm not trying to do anything. I broke the first seal just before you got here, so I wanted to use the opportunity to introduce myself. Then I'll bring in the first horseman according to Revelation, and be on my merry way." Deliverance's heart sank. You broke the first seal? But..." Pascal laughed. "You are positively adorable, Deliverance. And even less of an obstacle than I assumed. It's obvious you're a very new fledgling, and despite the reputation that precedes you, it appears you have yet to grow into your strengths. I must admit, your timing is terrible. I almost feel bad for you." Her face warmed, no doubt flushing red because Pascal was right. She's right, Deliverance thought, I am a fledgling. Admittedly so, and still brand new to magic in general, and she was obviously in way over her head. I need to stall for time. "Are the cogs in your brain moving, chérie?" Pascali's lips spread into a wickedly eerie smile. "Cat got your tongue?" Maybe Roman's brutish adherence to the rules would drive him to find her out in the woods. She could try to run, but the grin currently curling across Pascali's face made it clear that she wouldn't get very far. "Think, Deliverance. Think." She scrambled for something to say, and grabbed at the first thought in her head. "I thought Pascal was a boy's name." Pascali's grin faltered. "Not when it's spelled with an E. Did you really think I was a boy? Did you really think that any of this could be accomplished by a mere boy?" Deliverance had obviously struck a nerve of some kind, and decided to run with it. "Yeah, A stuck-up French bitch was pretty low on my list of expectations. The grin had vanished completely from Pascali's face, and there was a charged beat of silence before a cruel half-smile took its place. You will see, chérie. They will all see. In the moments before the world comes crashing apart, they will all know my name. In the meantime, she raised her hands in front of her as if holding something, I have more important things to deal with than a fledgling. Au revoir, Deliverance. Give up now, and maybe you can enjoy what little time you have left. Their eyes locked. Pascal muttered something unintelligible under her breath, then slowly drew her hands apart. She closed her eyes, and a vortex of shadows began swirling and expanding in the space between her hands. A lone figure materialized from the shadows, as if it had simply walked through a doorway. It was Klein, one of the horsemen. Once he was fully in the clearing, Pascal ended her incantation and released the shadows. She spared Deliverance another wicked smile and a wink, raised a hand in farewell, then took off into the woods, leaving Deliverance alone with the first horseman of the apocalypse. Did you miss me? Klein took a step forward. Chapter 41. Klein grinned, and Deliverance noticed that his teeth appeared to be rotting in his mouth. Gross. Deliverance, he said, his voice just as slimy as she remembered from their first encounter. So good to see you again. And I see you found my horse. He gestured at the fountain statue behind her, but she kept her eyes on him. Klein, she said in grudging acknowledgement. I'd say it's a pleasure, but I don't like lying to people. Even if they're bad people. He raised a hand to his chest, pretending to be offended. Oh, I'm not a bad person. In fact, I'm not really a person at all. Plus, he winked, I'm not inherently bad. I'm just doing my job. And ending the world in the process. Well, yes, I suppose that would skew your perception. He grinned again, and Deliverance felt a wave of nausea roll through her. Racking her brain, she searched for something, anything she could do to salvage her current situation. She was alone, unskilled, and had no guarantee the cavalry would arrive in time to help. They'd probably find her eventually, but Deliverance needed a way to get them here, before they'd have to scrape her off the pavement. Why me? She blurted, aiming for a distraction but also needing to know. What's my part in all of this? I'm a nobody. Klein raised an eyebrow and began stalking toward her in the fountain. If she could start him on a monologue, maybe that would buy her some time. The sisters had always told her that her mouth kept getting her into trouble, but maybe this time it would help get her out of a precarious situation. You certainly aren't a nobody, Klein said, still steadily closing the distance between them. Your fate is intertwined with the end of the world just as much as mine, and the other horsemen and Koi. Why, even Pascal has her role to play. We are all merely pieces on a chessboard, with different strengths and abilities. Your mother would have told you all about it, if she hadn't been taken from you before her time. Tisk tisk tisk. He shook his head. Such a pity. Deliverance's heart lurched. Koi had mentioned her mother as well, but no one was giving her any concrete answers. She wanted to scream in frustration, but instead, she gritted her teeth and thought of ways to push the conversation further. What does my mother have to do with this? Come on, Klein. You obviously want to tell me, so that you can hold it over my head. It might as well be now. Klein tapped the side of his nose with a finger. Knowledge is power, young fledgling. I'm sure you'll get to the information eventually, but it certainly won't be from me. Koi would have my head, and then I'd have to be a headless horseman, and that's not how I want to be remembered. How do you want to be remembered? Deliverance pressed, increasingly uncomfortable with the dwindling space between them. Klein considered her question, pausing in his steady forward momentum. I want to be remembered for who I am. Not as a mere horseman, or the silly name Klein Steep, but for who I truly am. A force of nature, an inevitability, pestilence. Deliverance shuddered at the word as pieces fell into place. Her revulsion, the verses in Revelation. Klein was pestilence, and she was no match for him. Deliverance. The voice, familiar, sounded distant. Oliver? She tilted her head, trying to pick up more of the sound without taking her eyes off Klein. Footsteps pounded behind her. Oliver was running toward her. A wave of panic shot through her. She didn't want Oliver to get hurt. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw two figures running behind Oliver, Roman and Professor Renove. Her attention returned to Klein, who was watching the approaching newcomers with amusement. "Oh my, what have we here?" Klein clasped his hands in front of him. "Friends to play with?" "Deliverance," Oliver shouted her name again. "No. Oliver, stop." Deliverance held out a hand. "Stay where you are." "Oh, come now." Klein's grin widened, showing decayed teeth along with rotting gums. "Don't be that way. Let him play." Oliver skidded to a stop, and Deliverance saw Jet anxiously fluttering above his shoulders. "Jet, you stay there too." Deliverance's panic sharpened, and tears began to prick at her eyes. She didn't know how Jet could help her, so she needed to make sure he was safe, even if that meant he couldn't be with her. Roman began striding toward her, and before Deliverance could warn him to back off, Klein flicked his fingers and knocked Roman off his feet. "I'm growing ever so bored. How about you and I play?" Klein then reached out a hand and gently stroked Deliverance's cheek. His touch felt like a chemical burn, and she yelped. Knowing he was pestilence, it very well may have been. He leaned forward, his rancid breath hot next to her ear. "None of them can see or hear me," he whispered. "I am a wraith to them. I am a ghost to everyone but you, which is why this will be so much more satisfying." Klein pushed past her, nimbly clearing the ledge of the fountain. Arm outstretched, his hand touched the limestone horse. "He's going for the crown." Deliverance knew instinctively that joining a horseman with his horse, as stated in Revelation, could only be a terrible thing. And so she did what any desperate and insane person would do. She leapt into the fountain and tackled Klein to the ground. The horseman easily knocked her off, hissing like an animal, and pulled her to her feet. "You do have spirit, that you do." He laughed maniacally, and with no apparent effort at all, he grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off her feet. Deliverance's airway was immediately cut off, and she grabbed at his arm, kicking her feet as much as she could, anything to gain purchase and breathe again. Klein's mouth twisted into a feral grin, as Deliverance clamped onto his wrist in vain, unable to remove herself from his unrelenting grip. "I could just kill you now," Klein said casually, cocking his head thoughtfully. "I'm supposed to keep you alive, so that you can watch the world around you crumble, but I could claim it was an accident. That you were somehow even weaker than I thought. No one would have to know." Deliverance spluttered, trying to choke words out, and renewed her grip on his wrist. Klein made a show of leaning toward her and listening closely. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Deliverance's vision was beginning to go black at the edges, but she managed to choke out the 4 words she needed. "They can see you." Klein's brow furrowed, then understanding dawned on his face. He was the only thing holding Deliverance off the ground, and she was clearly grasping his wrist, which gave her people a general location for where his body would be. In her dwindling peripheral vision, Deliverance saw Professor Renove lift her hands, then heard the hippie woman shout a series of unknown words before throwing a ball of crackling light directly at Klein. The horseman released his hold on Deliverance's throat, but it was too late. Renove's magical attack hit him square in the chest, and knocked him down into the basin of the fountain. Chapter 42. Precious air rushed into Deliverance's lungs, and in a matter of seconds Oliver was there, dragging her out of the fountain and away from Klein. Jet, in finch form, frantically circled her and Oliver, then he zapped into a flying squirrel and launched himself onto her chest. Cradling her familiar in her hands, she held him close, and Oliver embraced her in turn. She looked back to the fountain, where Renove and Roman were casting a series of complex spells against Klein. The professor's mousy hair writhed in an imaginary wind, and she wasn't flouncing anymore. Even with her small stature, she was even more imposing than Roman. Deliverance couldn't take her eyes off the sheer power being displayed before her. What looked to be a cage of light crept over Klein. He tried in vain to counteract the spells, but Renov and Roman were relentless, and eventually the cage fitted around Klein and melded into his skin. Klein screamed. His writhing became a series of rhythmic twitches, which then gave way to perfect stillness. He had been trapped somehow, and was now unable to move. Deliverance looked at Oliver, who was gaping at the spectacle. "I can see him now," Oliver whispered. "He's one of the horsemen?" Deliverance nodded, her throat too raw for her to try speaking just yet. She reached up a hand to gingerly examine the skin on her neck, and her fingertips came away sticky and red with congealing blood. Klein's hands had burned into her. She shuddered at the memory, and wondered how long this encounter would haunt her nightmares. Oliver helped her to her feet, and they slowly approached the fountain. Professor Renov muttered another spell, but Roman turned his attention to their huddled group, so the immediate threat of danger had passed. Her sentinel shadow didn't say anything, but he caught Deliverance's eye and gave her a small nod. It was clear that her break for freedom hadn't been a joyride, and the atmosphere in the clearing was solemn. Renov finished with her spell, then rushed over to Deliverance. "Let me have a look." Her eyes darted all over her body, lingering on her cheek and neck, and then their eyes met. Deliverance saw concern there, mixed with relief, exhaustion, and horror. It was an emotional cocktail that Deliverance knew was reflected back in her own eyes. Renov briefly scanned Oliver for signs of injury as well, and when she seemed satisfied, she stood up straight. "There is much to discuss, but we should wait until we can convene with the headmaster." Renov smoothed her hair back. "I don't want you to have to tell your story twice." "Well, that's a relief." Deliverance sighed. "And here I thought I'd have to repeat myself." Renov gave her that look that said, "Fledglings should be seen and not heard." So she bit her tongue and prepared to listen. "In the meantime," said Renov, "I'm going to send the buses on their way with the other students and arrange for separate transportation for us. I will also make sure a healer is waiting for us who can take care of the burns on your neck and face." Deliverance nodded her agreement to this plan, but needed to ask the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. "Professor Renov." Her voice barely came out a croak. "What happens to him now?" She and the others turned to where Klein was trapped motionless. The horseman was obviously still aware, his eyes darting between everyone. Renov sighed. "For now, he will be bound to the Continuum's prison deep beneath the academy. It has many layers of impenetrable protection, plus it's within the layered school wards. The headmaster will decide what happens to him from there." A muffled grunt sounded from Klein, and Deliverance flinched. His eyes burned into hers, and she took a step closer to try to make out the words. She trusted that Renov's confinement would hold. When she was close enough, Klein repeated his grunts, and they sent a shiver down Deliverance's spine. "Come. And see." Klein laughed, a grating sound that had to force its way through his tightly closed jaw. Renov moved her hands in a sharp, twisting motion that cut off the sound coming from his lips completely. Deliverance turned away from the trapped horseman. Oliver looped an arm protectively around her shoulders. The words she had read earlier from Revelation chapter 6 verse 1 now echoed in her mind. "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, 'Come and see.'" Chapter 43. Back at the academy, Headmaster Helms sat at his desk with his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The man had a way of sucking the fun and comfort right out of a room. Plus, it was as if he made it his personal mission to make Deliverance's life a living hell. She had just finished relaying her research and her recent encounter with Klein. The room was silent. Professor Renov sat in the chair next to Deliverance, and Oliver stood by the door, both having followed along and catching up the parts of the day that they had missed. Jet flew around in squirrel form, and often took to being a very clingy bracelet, but Deliverance didn't mind. They both needed the comfort after their harrowing separation. "Ms. Mackey," Helms said softly, "I believe I owe you an apology." "No kidding." Deliverance huffed, then glared at the headmaster. "Apology not accepted." He raised his brows, then opened his mouth as if to say something. If you had believed me, then we would have actually stood a chance against Pascal before she opened the first seal, and before she dragged Klein through whatever portal thing she summoned. His eyes brightened. Ms. Mackey? No. Listen closely, Petty. This has been one giant clusterfuck of magic on a literal worldwide scale, and an apology isn't going to cut it. One seal has already been broken, which means Pascal will be starting on the second. I don't need an apology, I need help. Are you going to give me that, or not? There was an uncomfortable silence in the room, as all eyes turned to the headmaster. He cleared his throat, then folded his hands on his desk. Yes, Ms. Mackey. I am going to give you help. From what I understand, you are undeniably involved, so even though you're a fledgling, I cannot dissuade you from moving forward with your research. And so help is what I shall give you. Deliverance hadn't been expecting that, so she just huffed again and crossed her arms. Okay, good. So. Now what? One seal is broken, but we have Klein out of action, so at least that's something, right? Renove cleared her throat, then raised a hand. The library is already at your disposal, and I would be willing to advance your coursework on an independent study basis. It will be challenging, but if you work hard, then I shall as well. Deliverance nodded, giving the professor a small smile. Despite herself, she was starting to like Renove. Plus, it was comforting to know that such a badass magic user would be helping hone her magical abilities. I can help too. That is, if it's okay. Oliver asked from the back of the room. There was a Latin-based connection to the fountain, and maybe I can work with different translations of Revelation to see if we can get more context. Oliver winked at Deliverance, and she grinned at him before turning back to Helms. The headmaster nodded his assent, and relief washed through her. Having Renove would be helpful, but with Oliver she would feel a lot less alone. If that's all, I will let you return to the rest of your weekends. Professor Renove, if you could draft some coursework for Ms. Mackey, then I will approve whatever you deem appropriate. And? One more thing, Deliverance interrupted. Helm sighed. Yes? She tried to keep her voice clear and even, resisting the urge to massage her neck where the burns had been before a healer had knitted her back together. I want to work with Roman on defensive fighting. Magic is great and all, but if it comes down to a fight with the next horseman, then I want some training. Very well. Headmaster Helms agreed to her request. She held her posture upright instead of sagging in relief. Her altercation with Klein had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Deliverance had been so hopelessly outmatched, and even though Klein was unnaturally strong, she wanted to be able to do more than just stand there defenseless. Besides, she remembered Roman's understanding nod back in the clearing. He had the emotional range of a paperclip, but she trusted him to get her physically capable to defend herself the next time she encountered a horseman or Pascal. Well, at least more capable than I am now. Chapter 44. Helms dismissed them, but Renove had stayed behind, presumably to talk about Deliverance's new coursework, which left her and Oliver to walk back to the dorms. Hey buddy, don't you want a perch on my shoulder? She even opened her pocket. Or curl up inside for a well-deserved nap. Jet shook his little head. He was determined to be a fluffy bracelet, and a fluffy bracelet he remained. She walked with Oliver in comfortable silence, and soon enough they were standing outside Deliverance's room just as they had so many times before. It was different this time. They were different. But she didn't think it was in a bad way. I knew you'd come. Gazing into Oliver's copper-colored eyes, she smiled softly, then pushed onto her tiptoes to press a kiss to his mouth. I'll always come for you. Oliver kissed her back and reached out a hand to twine their fingers together. Are you needing some alone time? Or do you want me to come inside? Deliverance had thought about that on the walk over and shook her head. I think I need some time with Jet. She lifted her wrist to show that her familiar was still being a bracelet. I think we both need some together time to calm down. Oliver nodded in understanding. I should probably go spend some time with Tasha. She isn't an attack fire drake, She's more of a nap fire drake, but maybe she can help somehow too. I'll talk with her about it. Okay. Deliverance smiled and gave him one more peck on the cheek before he left. She closed the door behind her, locked it, and went straight to her bathroom for a shower. Her clothes needed to be washed, but she just felt filthy in general after the whole day. Buddy, unless you want to shower with me, you gotta let go. He zapped into his salamander form for the first time in a long while, so that he could more comfortably stay in the steamy bathroom with her. Deliverance turned on the shower as hot as it would go, and scrubbed at her skin until it felt raw. A few silent tears streaked down her face too, and she let them wash down the drain along with the whole day's experience. After her shower, she changed into comfy clothes and tied up her wet hair without bothering to tame it in any way. When she was dry enough, Jet turned back into a flying squirrel bracelet, and Deliverance laid down with her wrist tucked close against her chest. Today was so awful, Jet, she whispered, needing to confess to someone. I'm so sorry I left you. I was so scared. I'm so sorry, little buddy. Jet squeaked softly and gripped her wrist tighter. Deliverance knew that Jet would forgive her. But from the way things looked at the moment, it would take a while for him to be comfortable with being apart for long. She dropped a kiss onto his tiny furry forehead, and he softly head-butted her chin in return. So to recap, she told Jet quietly, the first seal of 7 that are holding the world together has been broken. The first horseman has been bound to a magical, maximum security prison underneath the academy, thanks to Renove for being a total badass and all. Jet squeaked his thoughts too, adding what he felt the conversation needed. Well, Petty finally believes us and claims he's going to help. I'm going to get magical and physical defensive training. And hopefully, we'll catch up to Pascal before she can break the next seal and release the next horseman. Is that pretty much everything? Jet squeaked twice in confirmation and then yawned, which made Deliverance yawn in turn. All at once, she realized how exhausted she was, so she drew her comforter over her head to make a cocoon of warmth and safety for her and Jet tonight. It was a flimsy shield, but it was the best she could do right now. She and Oliver had agreed to take a recovery Sunday before diving back into their research, so starting Monday, their training would begin. I never want to be that helpless again, she thought to herself, then cuddled Jet closer. Deliverance was willing to do whatever it took to prepare herself for the next time she faced Pascal, because she was sure one thing, they would meet again. Pascal, Coy and the horsemen were clearly as much a part of this as Deliverance was. But this next time, Deliverance vowed, I'll be ready. And I'll bring the fight to them.
Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to a book by NinaKnight. Remember to subscribe and click the bell icon to stay updated on new releases.